Vanessa Brooks walked into the Bennett family office on a Tuesday morning like she owned it, because for years she'd acted like she did. She dropped a manila envelope onto the desk of Margaret, Ryan's personal assistant, and said, loud enough for the whole open floor to hear, "Make sure Ryan gets this before the wedding gift even gets unwrapped. His little bride needs to know what she's walking into." Inside the envelope, photographs, old ones. Ryan and Vanessa at dinner, at the Coast, at a New Year's party 3 years ago. On the back of each one, in Vanessa's handwriting, a single line: "He was never really yours to have." If you've ever watched someone get handed a marriage as a consolation prize and decide to turn it into something real anyway, this story is for you. Stay with us all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Carter family home had never been large, but it had always been full of sound, of cooking smells that leaked from the kitchen into the hallway, of her father's voice carrying from the back porch while he talked business on the phone. Emma remembered sitting at the top of the stairs as a girl, listening to him negotiate with suppliers, watching the way his shoulders squared when he thought a deal was going his way. He'd built Carter Interiors from a single furniture showroom in the suburbs of Columbus into a mid-size wholesale operation with a warehouse, a small delivery fleet, and 23 employees. 23 employees who no longer had jobs. Emma found out about the debt on a Thursday in late October. She'd driven home for the weekend, something she did once a month, out of habit more than obligation, and found her mother sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers she wasn't bothering to organize. That alone told Emma something was wrong. Her mother organized everything. She was the kind of woman who alphabetized the spice rack and color-coded the family calendar. The papers were bank notices, letters from creditors, a foreclosure notice on the warehouse dated 6 weeks earlier. "How long?" Emma asked, sitting down across from her. Her mother looked up. She looked older than she had at Emma's birthday in July. "Your father didn't want you to worry." "How long, Mom?" 2 years. She folded her hands on top of the papers like she was trying to hold them down. The big contracts dried up after the Meridian project fell through. He took out loans to keep people on payroll. Then he took out more loans. Emma didn't say anything for a long time. She sat in the kitchen of the house she'd grown up in and looked at the curtains her mother had sewn by hand and the cracked tile in the corner that her father had promised to fix for 11 years and never gotten around to, and she thought about the weight that had apparently been sitting on both of them without her knowing it. Her father came in from the garage around 7. He looked at Emma, looked at the papers, and sat down heavily in his chair like the act of sitting was something that took effort. "I was going to tell you," he said. "I know. I almost had it handled. There was a buyer interested in the warehouse, but then the market—" "Dad." She put her hand over his. "Stop. Just tell me where we are." They were $340,000 in debt, owed to 3 different creditors, with the warehouse already in foreclosure and the family home carrying a second mortgage that was 90 days past due. Her father's accountant had told him, privately, that short of someone buying the debt outright or extending a significant personal loan, there was no realistic path that didn't end in bankruptcy. Emma drove back to Columbus on Sunday evening. She didn't sleep well that week. The name Richard Bennett came up through a mutual contact, a woman named Diane, who'd gone to school with Emma's mother and now sat on the board of a local charitable foundation. It wasn't Diane's idea. She was simply the one who made the introduction. The actual idea, Emma would later learn, had originated with Richard Bennett himself, Ryan's father, who had known about the Carter family's situation through the same network of Columbus area business people who knew everything about each other's finances while pretending they didn't. Richard Bennett was 71 years old, sharp-eyed, and deliberate in the way of men who had spent decades building things with their hands before transitioning to managing other people who built things. Bennett Family Construction had been in operation since 1979. It was a real company, not a corporation, not a brand, but an actual family business with a name on the side of trucks and a building in Delaware County with a parking lot that filled up at 6:30 every morning. Richard had one son. Ryan Bennett was 34, ran the day-to-day operations of the company, and was, by all measurable accounts, a decent man in a complicated situation. What the measurable accounts didn't fully capture was Vanessa Brooks, who had been a fixture in Ryan's life for the better part of 6 years, and who had a talent for making that fixture look like love when it suited her and like leverage when it didn't. Emma met Richard first. He came to Columbus for lunch, so a real lunch. Not a meeting with coffee, but a table at a restaurant in Short North where he ordered the soup and looked at her steadily throughout the entire conversation. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said. "I'm not looking for a social arrangement. I'm looking for stability." "Stability for what?" "For Ryan." He set down his spoon. "My son is a good man who's made a bad habit of letting one person define his choices. I've watched it for 6 years. I'm not going to watch it for another 6. Emma kept her hands in her lap. "And you think marrying him to someone else fixes that?" "I think giving him a reason to build something real might." He looked at her without apology. "I also think you need the capital to clear your family's debt. I'm not pretending this is anything other than what it is." "What is it?" "A business agreement between 2 families, with the possibility of becoming something more, if both parties are willing." Emma thought about her father's face at the kitchen table. She thought about 23 employees who were gone. She thought about the curtains her mother had sewn. "I'd need to meet Ryan first," she said. "Of course." Ryan came to the second meeting the following week. He was taller than she'd expected, which wasn't a relevant observation, but was the first one she had. He shook her hand the way someone shakes a hand when they're trying very hard to appear comfortable and not quite succeeding. He sat down, ordered coffee, and looked at a fixed point somewhere past her left shoulder for approximately 45 seconds before seeming to consciously redirect his attention to her face. "This is a strange situation," he said. "Yes," Emma agreed. "It is. I want you to know I don't—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not approaching this as something routine. I know what's being asked of both of us." She studied him. He was tired. Not in the way people are tired after a long week, but in the way people are tired when something has been pulling at them for a long time and they haven't figured out how to make it stop. His eyes were brown and had the quality of someone who paid attention when he wanted to, which made the moments when he wasn't paying attention more obvious. "I need to ask you something directly," Emma said. "All right." "Vanessa Brooks. Are you still in love with her?" He didn't answer immediately. She watched him decide whether to give her the comfortable answer or the honest one, and she respected him slightly more when he chose the honest one. "I don't know what I am when it comes to her," he said. "That's the most accurate thing I can tell you." Emma nodded. "Okay." "Okay?" "It's more honest than I expected." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I'm not going into this with romantic expectations, Ryan. I'm going in with practical ones. I'll be a real partner in what this arrangement is supposed to accomplish. I won't embarrass your family. I'll behave like your wife in every setting where that matters. In return, you clear my family's debt, you treat me with respect, and you don't lie to me about the things that affect us both." He looked at her for a moment. "That's it?" "That's the baseline." She met his eyes. "What we build on top of it, if anything, is up to both of us." They were married on a Saturday in the first week of December at a small venue in Westerville that Richard had reserved without fanfare. The ceremony was short. Emma wore a dress she'd bought off a clearance rack at a boutique she liked, ivory, with long sleeves, simple enough that it didn't look like she was trying to perform happiness she didn't feel. Ryan wore a dark suit and stood very still at the altar, like someone bracing for something they'd already decided they could survive. Her parents were there. Her mother cried, which made Emma feel guilty, because she suspected the tears were the complicated kind. Relief and sadness mixed together in a ratio that didn't have a clean name. Her father shook Ryan's hand afterward and held it a beat longer than necessary and said something quiet that Emma couldn't hear from where she stood. Richard attended but said very little. He watched everything with the careful attention of someone keeping inventory. Vanessa was not invited. Everyone noticed. The reception was dinner at a private room in a restaurant downtown. 12 people total. Ryan's aunt told a long story about the construction company's early years that was mostly about Richard and only tangentially about Ryan. Emma talked to one of Ryan's cousins for 40 minutes about the difficulty of maintaining hardwood floors in older houses, which was not how she'd imagined spending her wedding evening, but was, in its own way, a grounding kind of conversation. Ryan was attentive at dinner. He pulled out her chair. He introduced her to the people she hadn't met. He laughed once, genuinely, at something his cousin said, and for a second she could see what he probably looked like when he wasn't carrying whatever it was he carried. It was a good laugh, easy. She filed it away without meaning to. They left the restaurant at 9:30. Emma woke the next morning at 6:15 to an empty bed. She lay there for a moment, looking at the ceiling of the room in the Bennett house where they'd agreed she would stay. It was the house Ryan lived in, a colonial-style two-story in a quiet part of Westerville that had been in the family since the late 90s. The room was furnished, but not personal. No photographs on the dresser, nothing on the nightstand that told her anything about who normally slept in it. She wasn't sure if that was Ryan's doing or just the nature of the space, and she wasn't going to spend the morning of her first day married speculating about it. She found Ryan's note on the kitchen counter. It was handwritten on a notepad from the company, the Bennett family construction logo printed at the top. The note said, "Early site visit, back by 6. Coffee is set to brew at 6:30. R." Emma stood in the kitchen in her pajamas and read the note twice. Then she folded it and set it beside the coffee maker and stood there while the machine did its job. She didn't cry. She'd known what this was. She'd agreed to it with clear eyes and a practical assessment of the available options. And she wasn't the kind of person who cried about things she'd chosen with full information. She poured herself coffee and sat at the kitchen table and thought about what she was going to do next. By the time she arrived at the Bennett family construction office the following Monday, Ryan had mentioned, somewhat awkwardly, that she was welcome to come by, no obligation, whenever she wanted to get a sense of the place. She had already been reading, not casually. She'd spent the weekend going through the company's public filings, the industry trade publications she could access online, anything that gave her a picture of where Bennett Construction sat in the current market and what pressures the mid-size regional construction sector was dealing with. The office building was a single-story structure on a 4-acre property in Delaware County. The parking lot was wide and practical and already half full at 8 in the morning. The lobby had a reception desk staffed by a woman named Pam, who had been with the company for 19 years and communicated through a combination of direct statements and extended eye contact that made most new people slightly uncomfortable. "You're Emma," Pam said when she walked in. "Yes." "Ryan said to set you up in the conference room." Pam looked at her for a second longer than strictly necessary. "Can I get you anything?" "Just water, thanks." The conference room had a long table and windows that looked out over the equipment yard. Emma set her bag down and looked out at the yard for a minute. The excavators parked in rows, the company trucks with the logo on the doors, the small crew of men in work boots who were loading something onto a flatbed, and felt the first small stirring of something she might call interest. Ryan appeared 20 minutes later, still in his field jacket, and sat across from her at the table like this was a meeting, which she supposed it was. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," he said. "I said I would." "I know." He pulled off his jacket and hung it on the back of his chair. "I didn't mean it as a criticism." She looked at him. He looked like he'd been up since 5. There were early mud stains on his boots. "Tell me about the company," she said. So he did. He talked for an hour about the projects they had in progress, the ones they'd bid on and lost, the subcontractors they relied on, the 2 project managers who'd left in the last 18 months and hadn't been fully replaced. He talked about materials costs and the way supply chain disruptions had eaten into margins that were already thin. He talked about his father's gradual withdrawal from day-to-day operations and the adjustment that had required. He was different when he talked about work, clearer, less guarded. The tiredness in his eyes shifted into something that looked more like engagement, and Emma thought, there he is. That's what he actually cares about. She asked questions. Good ones, she thought. He seemed to think so too, because at one point he stopped mid-sentence and looked at her with mild surprise and said, "You've been doing homework." "I read what I could find." "Why?" She considered the question. "Because if I'm going to be here, I'd rather be useful." He looked at her for a moment. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She kept her voice even. "I'm choosing to." The first time she encountered Vanessa Brooks in person was a Wednesday, 11 days into the marriage, in the parking lot of a coffee shop on the north side of Westerville. Emma had stopped for coffee on her way to the office. a habit she'd picked up in Columbus and hadn't abandoned. She was walking back to her car with her cup and her bag when a woman in a white coat stepped out of a silver sedan parked 2 spots over and said, loudly enough that 2 people on the sidewalk turned to look, "Oh, you must be the rescue package." Emma stopped. Vanessa Brooks was beautiful the way certain things are beautiful. High maintenance and aware of it, constructed with effort that was meant to look effortless. She was Emma's age or close to it, with dark hair and a direct way of looking at people that communicated, without subtlety, that she thought she understood the situation better than anyone else in it. "Excuse me?" Emma said. "The wife." Vanessa smiled. It was a very particular kind of smile. "Ryan's charity project. I've heard so much about your situation." She said situation the way people say it when they want to make sure you understand they mean something worse. Emma looked at her steadily. She was aware of her heartbeat. She was also aware that this was a test, not one she'd asked for or been warned about, but one she was standing in the middle of regardless. "I know who you are," Emma said. "Ryan's mentioned you." Something shifted in Vanessa's expression. Small, but Emma caught it. "I'm sure he has." It was nice to put a face to the name. Emma adjusted the strap of her bag. "Excuse me." She walked to her car, got in, and drove 3 blocks before she pulled over and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Her heart was going faster than she'd like. Her face felt warm. She sat there and breathed and let the moment pass, and then she put the car back in drive and went to the office and got to work. She didn't tell Ryan about it. Not then. What she told herself was this. She had agreed to a marriage that was not, in the conventional sense, a marriage. She'd walked in with her eyes open, and what she'd seen that morning in the parking lot was not a revelation. It was confirmation. Ryan Bennett was still tangled up in Vanessa Brooks in ways that weren't going to untangle themselves because of a legal document and a December ceremony in Westerville. She couldn't fix that. She couldn't even try to fix it without becoming something she didn't want to be. What she could do was work. And so she worked. The office operated on a system that had apparently evolved organically over 20 years, which meant it had the particular charm of something nobody had ever stopped to question. Purchase orders were processed through 3 different people depending on which department originated them. Vendor invoices were tracked on a spreadsheet that a project coordinator named Dale had built in 2009 and which had been modified so many times by so many different people that several of its formula cells no longer calculated correctly. The company's expense tracking for subcontractor billing was, and Emma discovered this slowly, carefully, without announcing what she was finding, running somewhere between 15 and 20% over what the project estimates should have allowed for. She didn't say anything the first week. She sat in the conference room or at the small desk they'd cleared for her near the back of the office, and she watched, and she asked small questions that sounded casual and weren't, and she built a picture. Ryan was running a company that was technically functional and actually quite good at the work. The construction itself, the client relationships, the field operations. What it wasn't good at was the unglamorous infrastructure that held the financial side together. Nobody had designed it badly on purpose. It had just grown in the way things grow when the people growing it are focused entirely on the visible work and not the systems underneath. She built a document, not a presentation. She wasn't ready to present anything yet. A working document, for herself, mapping what she saw and where she thought it was costing them. She was on page 4 when Ryan came into the conference room one afternoon around 4 o'clock and stopped when he saw the whiteboard behind her, which she'd been using to diagram the purchase order flow. He looked at it for a long moment. "What is this?" he asked. "A diagram." "Of what?" "Your approval process for vendor payments." She turned back to the whiteboard. "There's a redundancy here that's adding roughly 3 days to your payment cycle on average. That means you're routinely in the late payment window with smaller vendors, which means some of them are quietly adding a late fee buffer to their bids on the front end." Ryan was quiet. "I can show you the numbers if you want," Emma said, "but I didn't want to bring it to you until I'd checked my assumptions." He pulled out a chair and sat down. Not at the end of the table. In the middle, close enough to see the whiteboard clearly. He looked at the diagram without speaking for long enough that she started to wonder if she'd overstepped. Then he said, "Dale built that process." "I know, he told me." It used to work better when we had 2 fewer project managers and the volume was lower. I figured. She sat down across from him. I'm not trying to criticize it. I'm trying to understand it. There's a difference. He looked at her. Why do you care? It was the second time he'd asked her something like that. The first time she'd given him the practical answer. This time she thought about what was actually true and said it. Because I've watched my father build something and lose it, she said. Not because he was bad at the work, because the underneath part came apart. She kept her eyes on his. I don't want to watch that happen here. Ryan was quiet again. Then, you said you checked your assumptions. Most of them. Show me what you haven't checked yet. She turned back to the whiteboard. There was a staff meeting that Friday that Emma attended at Ryan's invitation. He mentioned it the day before, almost as an afterthought, the way he mentioned most things that required him to acknowledge they were building a rhythm together. It was a weekly operations meeting, 12 people around the conference table, project managers and office staff, and one subcontractor coordinator who dialed in from a job site in Marysville. Emma sat against the wall and listened. She didn't speak during the meeting. She watched the way people talked to each other, who interrupted whom, who deferred even when they clearly had something to say, where the energy in the room went flat. After the meeting, a woman named Carol, mid-50s, project coordinator, the kind of person who refills everyone's water without being asked and remembers the names of people's kids, stopped Emma on her way out of the conference room. You were watching us pretty hard in there, Carol said. Not accusatory, observational. I was trying to get oriented, Emma said. Carol nodded. It's a good company. She said it like someone who meant it, and also like someone who was aware that good companies can have bad seasons. Richard built it right. How long have you been here? 14 years. She picked up her notepad. Things have been a little unsettled lately. People are waiting to see what settles. Emma understood what Carol was telling her. The company wasn't just watching to see what Ryan would do. It was watching to see what Emma would do, what her presence here meant, whether she was going to be someone who sat in a conference room with a title on a door or someone who showed up in a way that mattered. She wasn't going to answer that with a speech. She was going to answer it by coming back on Monday. Ryan came home late most nights. Emma had been there long enough to understand that late was his default. Not avoidance exactly, though she suspected there was some of that too, but habit. He'd been running on a schedule that put him at job sites before sunrise and back at his desk in the afternoon and home when the day was done, which was usually around 7:30 or 8. They ate dinner together most nights. This had evolved without either of them formally proposing it. She cooked because she was already home, and because cooking was something she did when she needed to think. And he came home to food on the table and sat down and ate it, and over the course of a few weeks, this had become the shape of their evenings. The conversations at dinner were careful, not cold, careful. The distinction mattered. They both worked at it in a way that didn't entirely look like work. They talked about the company, about projects, about things she'd noticed and things he was trying to figure out. Sometimes they talked about other things. She mentioned Columbus. He mentioned a project in his early 20s that had almost bankrupted the company and what his father had done to pull it back. Small exchanges, carefully offered. One night, about 3 weeks in, he came home and she could tell before he sat down that something had happened. He had a particular stillness when something had gotten to him. Not anger, not sadness, just this quality of having pulled everything slightly inward. Rough day? She asked. Vanessa called the office. Emma set down her fork. Okay. She does that. He picked up his water glass. Set it down. I don't... He stopped. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't happen. She looked at him across the table. What did she want? To talk. He said it flatly, like the word tasted bad. She does that too. And? I didn't take the call. He finally looked at her directly. I wanted you to know that. Emma held his gaze for a moment. She could feel the weight of what he was trying to give her. A small piece of good faith, a signal, something to work with. She didn't want to receive it with too much warmth or too little. Thank you for telling me, she said. He nodded. They went back to eating, and the subject didn't come up again that night, but something about the air in the room was different. Fractionally, almost imperceptibly different. Like a door that had been shut tight, had been turned one click toward open. Emma lay awake that night and thought about what she'd gotten herself into. Not with regret. She didn't go down that road because regret without action was useless, but with something like clarity. She was married to a man who was still in the grip of a woman who didn't love him, who was learning to run a company that had real potential and real problems, who was choosing to stay rather than perform a marriage from a careful distance. She'd told Ryan she wanted to be useful. That was true. But the more honest thing, the thing she hadn't said out loud to anyone, was that she wanted to build something real. Not a performance, not a comfortable arrangement, something real, whatever that ended up looking like. She didn't know yet what it would be, but she was starting to see the shape of it. The second time she encountered Vanessa was not accidental. Vanessa came to the office. She walked in on a Thursday afternoon like she had every right to be there, which Emma suspected was the point, and she stopped in the lobby and looked around with the particular expression of someone returning to a place they'd decided still belonged to them. Pam, at the front desk, had the kind of face that communicated exact amounts of information when you knew how to read it. The expression she was wearing when Emma came through the lobby and saw Vanessa standing there communicated, "This is a known problem. I am aware of the situation, and I am watching to see what you do." Vanessa turned when she heard Emma's footsteps. Her smile came up instantly. "Emma, I was hoping to catch Ryan." "He's not in today." Emma kept her voice neutral. "He's at the Marysville site." "I know." Vanessa's smile didn't change. "I actually came to see you." Emma waited. "I thought we should talk," Vanessa said, woman to woman, without Ryan in the middle. "About what?" "About what you're walking into." She said it with a quality of concern that was entirely manufactured. "I care about Ryan. Whatever else you might think of me, I do care about him, and I don't think he's told you the full picture." Emma looked at her. Behind Vanessa, Pam had become very interested in something on her computer screen. "I think," Emma said, "that whatever Ryan chooses to tell me is Ryan's decision." "That's very diplomatic." Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "But you should know that I've been part of this family for years. That doesn't just go away because of a piece of paper." Emma thought about the note she'd found on the kitchen counter the morning after her wedding. She thought about the photograph Carol had described seeing on Ryan's desk 2 years ago. Vanessa at a company holiday party, standing with her arm through his like she was planted there. She thought about the call Ryan hadn't taken. "Is there something specific you needed?" Emma asked. Vanessa studied her for a moment. Whatever she was looking for, a crack, a waiver, some evidence that Emma could be rattled. She didn't find it. "No," she said. "I think I just wanted to see you in person." "All right." Emma nodded once. "I'll let Ryan know you stopped by." Vanessa's expression shifted very slightly at that. Then she turned and walked back through the lobby and out through the front door, and Pam watched her go with an expression that, if translated into language, would have been roughly, "good." Emma went back to her desk. She sat down. She looked at the document she'd been working on, which was a revised vendor payment proposal she planned to bring to Ryan at the end of the week. Her hands were steady. She wasn't frightened of Vanessa. That wasn't it. What she felt was something more uncomfortable than fear, a kind of patience that had to be maintained deliberately, had to be held in place against the very human impulse to react, to escalate, to say "you don't scare me" to someone who was actively trying to scare you. She didn't give Vanessa the reaction. She gave her nothing but a steady look and a closed door, and she went back to work. That evening, Ryan came home at 7:15 and found Emma in the kitchen. He hung up his jacket and washed his hands at the sink, a habit she'd noticed. He always washed his hands the moment he came in from a site, even if he'd washed them before leaving. And then he stood at the counter and said without preamble, "Pam told me Vanessa came by." "Yes?" "What did she say?" Emma carried 2 plates to the table. "That she wanted me to understand the full picture." Ryan stood still for a moment. He looked like he was choosing between several responses and wasn't sure which one was right. "Emma, I'm not upset with you," she said. She set the plates down and looked at him. She came on her own. She said what she came to say. I didn't give her anything, and she left. He looked at her, that quality she'd noticed before. The careful attention, when he chose to use it, was fully on her now. "You're not going to ask me to—" "No." "Why not?" She pulled out a chair and sat down. "Because I don't want a husband I had to make ultimatums to get. Whatever this becomes, it has to be actual." She met his eyes. "I'd rather wait and have something real than push and have a performance." Ryan stood at the counter for another moment. Then he pulled out his chair and sat down across from her, and he looked at her for a long time in the way he sometimes looked at the whiteboard diagrams, like he was mapping something. "You're a strange person," he said, not unkindly. "I've been told." He picked up his fork. They ate. Outside, the December night had settled into the particular quiet of a suburban street after 8, when the last cars had come home and the neighborhood had done with its noise for the day. Neither of them said anything about Vanessa again. But when Ryan passed her in the kitchen later that night, reaching for a glass from the cabinet above the sink, he paused for just a second, one beat too long to be entirely accidental, and said, "Thank you for how you handled it." Emma nodded. She didn't say "you're welcome." She didn't say anything. She just nodded and let it be enough. The vendor payment proposal went through on a Friday afternoon in January, 6 weeks after Emma had first diagrammed the approval process on the conference room whiteboard. Ryan had taken it to his 2 senior project managers, a man named Gerald, who had been with Bennett Construction for 11 years, and had a voice like gravel and a deeply conservative attitude toward any change that hadn't been his idea, and a younger woman named Teresa, who ran the residential division and had a habit of agreeing with Gerald in meetings and then doing whatever she'd originally planned anyway. Gerald's response to the proposal had been, "It's not broken." Emma had sat across the table from him and said, "It's costing us approximately $40,000 a year in soft losses. Vendor markup on late payment risk, expedited delivery fees when the payment delay backs up material orders. 2 instances in the last fiscal year where a subcontractor walked off a job mid-project because their 3rd invoice was 60 days past due." Gerald had looked at her the way men of a certain age sometimes look at women who have just said something accurate in a room where they hadn't expected accuracy. Not hostility, exactly. More like recalibration. "Where'd you get those numbers?" he asked. "Dale's spreadsheet, the one from 2009. A short silence. "The formula cells are wrong on the subcontractor tab," she added. "I corrected them." Teresa had pressed her lips together in a way that Emma had learned meant she was trying not to smile. Ryan approved the proposal. He did it without a long deliberation, which surprised Gerald and didn't surprise Emma. She was beginning to understand that Ryan's instincts were usually sound. The problem was that he'd spent years in an environment where certain voices carried more weight than they'd earned, and he'd gotten into the habit of second-guessing himself in proportion to how loudly someone pushed back. The new payment process went into effect the 2nd week of January. It wasn't elegant. There were 3 weeks of adjustment where people forgot the new routing and sent things to the wrong inbox, and Dale had to send the same reminder email 4 times. But by the end of the month, it was running, and the first subcontractor invoice that cleared on day 12 instead of day 38 generated a small email from a concrete supplier named Hector Rodriguez that said simply, "Thank you for paying on time. It makes a difference." Emma printed that email and put it in a folder she kept in her desk drawer. She wasn't sure why. It just seemed like the kind of thing worth holding on to. The cold really set in the 2nd week of January, the kind that stiffened the mud on the job sites and made the early mornings feel like a physical argument with the day. Ryan was gone by 5:30 most mornings now, dealing with the complications that winter brought to active construction. Frozen ground, delayed concrete pours, workers who moved slower in the cold and couldn't always be blamed for it. Emma started arriving at the office earlier too, not to mirror him, but because the early quiet of the building was when she did her best thinking. She was there one morning at 7 when Carol came in, shaking the cold off her coat, and found Emma already at the whiteboard in the conference room with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. Carol stood in the doorway for a moment. "You're going to make the rest of us look bad," she said. "You've been here 14 years, Emma said. "I think you've earned some moral credit." Carol poured herself coffee from the office machine, the old one in the break room, not the nicer one in the lobby, and came into the conference room and sat down at the table. She didn't ask what Emma was working on. She just looked at the board with the same direct attention she brought to everything. Equipment maintenance scheduling, Emma said. I pulled the service records for the last 3 years. There's a pattern where the same 3 pieces of equipment generate most of the unplanned downtime, but they're not on an accelerated inspection cycle. They should be. Carol nodded slowly. Gerald manages equipment. I know. He's going to say you're overstepping. He's going to say a lot of things. Emma picked up her coffee, found it too cold, set it down again. That's okay. Carol looked at her. It was the kind of look that carried a question that wasn't going to be asked directly, so Emma waited. Carol said, eventually, why are you doing all this? And I don't mean that the way it might sound. I mean, you've been here 6 weeks. You could be sitting in a nice office with your name on the door and nobody would say anything. But you're in here at 7 in the morning arguing with equipment maintenance records. Emma thought about how to answer that. She thought about what she'd told Ryan, that she'd watched her father lose something real because the underneath came apart. That was true, but it wasn't the complete truth. I need to know I'm doing something that matters, she said. Not because someone gave me a title, because I actually made it better. Carol held her coffee cup with both hands and looked at the whiteboard. Richard's going to like you, she said finally. I'm not doing it for Richard. I know. Carol stood up. That's why he's going to like you. The equipment maintenance proposal was harder than the payment process. Gerald didn't just push back. He went to Ryan directly, which Emma had expected, and told him that Emma was making changes without understanding how field operations worked, which was true in the specific and false in the aggregate. She understood field operations well enough to identify the problem. She just didn't know all the names of all the parts. Ryan came to her after his conversation with Gerald. He sat down in the chair across from her desk and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as his version of sorting through something, and said, Gerald says you pulled the equipment service files without asking. I asked Dale. Dale isn't Gerald. Dale manages the files. She kept her tone even. I needed to see the pattern. I wasn't making any changes. I was building a picture. Ryan was quiet for a moment. He's been here 11 years. I know, and he knows those machines. That's actually why the proposal works. I'm not trying to change who handles the maintenance. I'm trying to change the scheduling logic. She slid a printed copy of the document across the desk to him. The 3 pieces on the proposed accelerated cycle are the same 3 that Gerald has had to emergency service 4 times in 2 years. He already knows their problems. I'm just suggesting we get ahead of it instead of reacting. Ryan looked at the document. He didn't read all of it. He found the section on the 3 pieces of equipment and read that, and she could see him matching what she'd written against what he knew from 2 years of watching Gerald deal with those machines. He's not going to like that I approve this, Ryan said. No, he's not. You're okay with that. She met his eyes. I'm not trying to make Gerald like me. I'm trying to make the company run better. Those are different goals, and I can only chase one of them. Ryan tapped the document once against the desk, then again, then put it flat. I'll talk to him. You don't need to smooth it over, Emma said. Just approve it, or don't. He looked at her with that careful attention, the full kind. I'm going to approve it, he said, and I'm going to talk to him anyway. Not because you need protecting, because he needs to understand that this is how it's going to work. Emma held his gaze. There was something in what he'd just said, not the content, but the quality of it, the way he'd made the distinction, that sat with her after he left the room. She went back to work and didn't think about it consciously, but it stayed somewhere in the back of her mind like a note she hadn't opened yet. February came in gray and persistent. The Marysville project had hit a delay because of a concrete supplier issue that was only partly related to the payment process. A materials shortage upstream that nobody could have predicted, but that Gerald brought up in the next staff meeting in a way that made it sound like it might be related, which it wasn't. Emma didn't correct him in the meeting. She sent Ryan a 1-paragraph email afterward with the supplier documentation attached, and he read it and didn't say anything, and she understood that was enough. Vanessa came by the office again in February. This time she didn't pretend it was accidental. She came on a Tuesday afternoon while Ryan was at a site walkthrough and Emma was in the conference room with Teresa going over the residential division's Q1 numbers. Pam knocked on the conference room door and opened it with the expression that Emma now recognized specifically as the Vanessa expression, a slight tightening around the eyes that communicated I tried without saying anything, and said, "Someone here to see you." Emma came out into the lobby. Vanessa was standing near the window in a coat that had clearly been purchased to be noticed. "Ryan's not here," Emma said. "I know." Vanessa smiled. "I came to see you." It was almost word for word what she'd said in January. Emma wondered if she had a script or if this was just how Vanessa operated, circling back to the same approach until something gave. "I'm in the middle of something," Emma said. "This won't take long." Vanessa's eyes moved past Emma to the conference room door, which was still open, and Teresa could be seen at the table with papers in front of her, very deliberately not looking at the lobby. "I just thought you should know. People are talking." "About what?" "About you." Vanessa said it with a constructed sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. "About the way you've been inserting yourself into the business. Some people think it's—" She paused, choosing the word with care. "A little aggressive, for someone who's only been here 2 months." Emma looked at her. She thought about Gerald's reaction to the payment proposal. She thought about whether Vanessa was reporting an actual conversation she'd had with someone in this office, which would require a connection Emma didn't fully understand yet, or whether she was manufacturing a threat out of partial information. She decided it was probably some of both. "I appreciate you telling me," Emma said, in a tone that indicated she did not particularly appreciate it. "Was there anything else?" Vanessa's composure shifted very slightly. The smile stayed, but something behind it recalibrated. "You're not worried." "I'm trying to finish a meeting." "Emma." She said the name with a weight that was supposed to mean something. "I've known Ryan for 6 years. I know this company. I know everyone in it. You've been here 2 months and you're rewriting processes and pulling files and acting like you own the place." The sympathy dropped away, and something more direct showed up underneath. "I'm trying to help you understand that it doesn't work like that." "How does it work?" Emma asked. Vanessa looked at her. "No, I'm genuinely asking," Emma said. "You've known Ryan for 6 years. You know this company. You know everyone in it. How does it work?" A beat of silence. "Because from where I'm standing," Emma continued, "the company has a cash flow problem that's been building for 3 years, an equipment maintenance cycle that's been generating preventable downtime, and a morale issue in the field that comes partly from people feeling like the office doesn't actually care what their day looks like." She kept her voice measured. Not cold. Measured. "I'm trying to help with those things. If someone has a problem with how I'm going about it, I'd rather hear it from them directly." Vanessa stood very still. "But if this is just—" Emma paused. "A courtesy visit, I'll let Ryan know you came by." Vanessa left. Her heels on the lobby floor made a sound that communicated something she wasn't saying with words, and then she was gone through the front door, and Pam was looking at her monitor with an expression that communicated deep professional neutrality, and also something that looked a lot like satisfaction. Emma went back to the conference room. Teresa looked up from the Q1 numbers. "Sorry," Emma said. "Where were we?" Teresa looked at her for a moment, then, "Line 47. The subcontractor variance." "Right." Emma sat down and picked up her pen. "So the variance is higher than it should be because Gerald approved a change order in November without running it through the standard review," Teresa said. She said it quickly, like she'd been waiting for the right moment to say it for a while. "It's been sitting in the numbers looking like a materials cost when it's actually a scope change that should have been client billed." Emma looked up. "How much?" 11,000. Emma wrote it down. "Okay, let's look at the change order." They worked for another hour. Teresa was precise and slightly guarded, the way people are when they've been in an organization long enough to know which truths are expensive to tell. But Emma had learned how to ask questions that made the truth easier to offer. Not leading questions, not pointed ones, just open-ended space that gave someone room to put something down they'd been carrying. By the time they finished, it was past 5 and the office had gone quiet. Teresa gathered her papers and then looked at Emma with an expression that wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a statement. "Can I say something? Please? You're not what I expected." Emma waited. "I don't mean that as an insult," Teresa said. "I mean, people talked when we found out Ryan was getting married. People wondered whether it was real, whether you were going to be a problem." She folded her papers. "You're not a problem. You're actually—" She seemed to be choosing the word with some care. "Useful. And I don't mean that in a reduced way. I mean it in the real way." Emma looked at her. She thought about saying something deflecting, something modest and easy. She decided that wasn't the right response to someone who'd just given her something honest. "Thank you," she said. "That actually means something." March was when things started to shift in a way that was visible to people who hadn't been paying close attention before. The equipment maintenance changes had gone into effect in mid-February, and the first beneficiary had been a dozer on the Marysville site that would, under the old schedule, have gone another 6 weeks before its next inspection. Under the new cycle, it was pulled for service in week 2, and the mechanic found a hydraulic issue that would have, at minimum, sidelined the machine for a week during active grading work if it had been caught in the field. Gerald had said nothing about this directly, but he'd stopped CCing the wrong people on his maintenance update emails, which Emma had learned was Gerald's version of acknowledgement. She was in the office break room one afternoon in early March when Gerald came in and poured himself coffee and stood at the counter for a moment and then said without looking at her, "The Rodriguez supply account paid on time again this month." "They did," Emma said. "Hector usually nickels and dimes the material quotes." "I know, the late payment markup adds up." Gerald drank his coffee. He still wasn't looking at her. "My brother-in-law runs a small electrical subcontracting business," he said. "When his clients pay late, he doesn't have enough float to cover his guys' checks some weeks." Emma looked at Gerald's profile. He was looking at his coffee cup with the expression of someone who had more to say and was figuring out if he was going to say it. "The payment fix was a good call," he said. Finally. It came out like something heavy being set on a table. "Thank you, Gerald." He grunted and left with his coffee. Emma stood in the break room for a moment. She allowed herself, privately, to count that as something, then she went back to work. Ryan noticed the shift in Gerald before Emma mentioned it. He came home one evening in mid-March and said, while hanging up his jacket, "Gerald defended your equipment proposal in the field supervisor meeting today." Emma looked up from the kitchen counter. "He did?" When one of the site leads said the new inspection cycle was slowing down equipment availability, Gerald told him to read the service cost data from the last 2 years and get back to him. Ryan came to the counter and leaned against it. He was watching her with that look again, the one that cataloged. "That's not something Gerald does for people he doesn't respect. Or people he thinks are wrong," Emma said. "Gerald can hold both at once." A small pause. "You got to him." "I didn't try to get to him. I just gave him something accurate." Ryan was quiet for a moment, and she recognized the quiet now. It was the same one he used when something was working itself out in his head that hadn't finished working yet. She'd learned not to fill his silences, which hadn't been natural for her. She was someone who reached for words when things got quiet, but she'd learned it because his silences were usually productive. "Richard wants to come by the office next week," he said. "I know. He emailed me." Ryan looked at her. "He emailed you directly?" "Tuesday. He asked if Wednesday morning worked for me." A beat. "He didn't email me." "He probably assumed you'd be at a site," Emma said. She watched Ryan absorb this, the small recalibration of finding out that his father had begun treating his wife as someone with a separate, direct line of communication. "Is that a problem?" Ryan took a moment. Then, "No, it's not a problem." Richard came on Wednesday at 9. He walked through the office with Ryan, who had rearranged his morning to be there, and then he sat down in the conference room with Emma and a cup of coffee and looked at the current state of the whiteboard, which showed the Q1 financial summary she'd been building for the monthly review. He didn't say anything for a while. He drank his coffee and looked at the board the way he'd looked at her in the restaurant the first time they met, steadily, without rushing toward a conclusion. "You found the change order variance," he said. "Teresa found it," Emma said. "I just asked the right questions." "Same thing." He set down his cup. That's been sitting in the book since November. I know. Nobody else caught it. They weren't looking at the right column. She sat across from him. It's fixed now. We client billed it last week. Teresa handled the communication with the client. Richard nodded once. Ryan tell you I had concerns about this arrangement? Initially. Emma looked at him. No. I proposed it, but I had concerns. He held her gaze without apology. I wasn't sure you'd stay when things were difficult. I thought you might decide the terms weren't worth the difficulty. The terms are fine, Emma said. That's not what I mean. She understood what he meant. I knew what I was walking into, she said. I'm not going to pretend it's been easy. But walking away from something because it's hard isn't really my instinct. Richard studied her. Vanessa's been making phone calls. Emma kept her expression even. To whom? To anyone who might listen. She called one of our larger clients last week, introduced herself as a longtime advisor to the company. He said it flatly, without effect. She's looking for leverage. What did the client say? He called Ryan to ask who she was. A pause. Ryan told him she was a former associate with no current connection to the company. Emma thought about this. About Vanessa calling clients? About the patience required to not react to that, to not go find Vanessa and have a direct conversation that would feel satisfying in the moment and useful in no way afterward. She's getting louder, Emma said. She's getting scared, Richard said. There's a difference. He stood up. He was a tall man, still straight despite his age, and he had the quality of someone who had spent decades on job sites and carried that physicality in the way he occupied a room. You're doing good work here, Emma. She looked up at him. I'm doing what made sense to do. That's what good work usually is. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. I'll let you get back to it. After he left, she sat in the conference room for a minute and looked at the whiteboard. She thought about Vanessa making phone calls. She thought about the particular quality of desperation that made someone reach that far, that openly, for something they couldn't seem to let go. She felt sorry for her, almost. Then she remembered the envelope in Pam's inbox on the first morning of her marriage, the photographs with, "He was never really yours to have written on the back," and she decided the almost was as far as she was willing to go. The company's quarterly staff meeting was the last Thursday in March. It was a bigger version of the weekly operations meetings, all staff, including field supervisors and the dispatch team, about 30 people in the main conference space, which required borrowing chairs from 3 other rooms and still left 4 people standing near the back wall. Ryan ran the meeting. He covered the Q1 numbers, the project status updates, the outlook for the spring pipeline. Emma sat at the table and contributed when he turned to her for the financial summary, which she gave from memory because she knew the numbers well enough not to need notes. Afterward, in the parking lot, a field supervisor named Marcus, a compact man in his 40s with weathered hands and a way of saying exactly as much as he meant and not one word more, caught up with her as she was walking to her car. "You're the one who changed the payment schedule," he said. "The office payment process, yes." He nodded. "My guys work with a concrete subcontractor on the Westerville project. Hector Rodriguez. I know who he is. He told one of my guys that this is the first company he's worked with in 3 years that actually pays when they say they're going to." Marcus looked at her with a directness that she'd come to associate with people who spent their days on job sites and didn't have time for indirection. That matters. When your subs trust you, they show up for the hard days. "I know," Emma said. He nodded again. Then he got in his truck. Emma stood in the parking lot for a moment, her breath visible in the cold March air, and felt something settle. Not pride, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of a thing mattering in a way that could be measured. She drove home. Ryan's truck was already in the driveway, which was early for him. She found him in the kitchen, not cooking. He never cooked, one of the things she'd simply absorbed about him without comment, but standing at the counter with a glass of water and the expression she now recognized as his processing face. "Long day?" she asked. Teresa handed in her resignation. Emma stopped. "What?" "Effective end of April." He set down the glass. She said she's been offered a director-level position at a firm in Columbus. More money, bigger scope. He looked at Emma. She said she'd had the offer for 2 months and wasn't going to take it, and then changed her mind. Emma set her bag on the counter. Did she say why? She said. Ryan paused, and his expression was complicated, the way it got when something surprised him in a direction he hadn't planned for. She said working with you these last few months showed her what it looked like to actually run the financial side of a construction operation versus just keeping up with it, and it made her realize she was capable of wanting more. Emma was quiet for a moment. She said it as a compliment, Ryan said. If it helps? It does. She sat down at the kitchen table. It also means you need to fill her role. I know. He came to the table and sat down across from her. I want to talk to you about that, about the structure going forward, the role Teresa plays, the residential division oversight, the financial reporting. It doesn't make sense to replace it directly. You want to restructure the division. I want to know what you think makes sense. She looked at him. A month ago, he would have gone to Gerald with this question, or called his father. He still would, probably. But he was starting here, with her, and that was new. Tell me what you know about the residential division's pipeline for the next 18 months, she said, and then tell me what you think the gap is. Not what Gerald would say. What you think. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then he started talking, and she listened, and outside the window March was doing what March does in Ohio. Turning cold, and then almost warm, and then cold again, never quite committing. And they sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours and built something together that was part business plan and part conversation, and in the space between those two things, something else that neither of them named. She was aware of it. She suspected he was aware of it too. Neither of them said anything about it. They kept working. That felt to Emma like exactly the right choice. Vanessa came to the office one more time in March, the last Friday of the month. Emma was in a meeting with Gerald and a subcontractor when Pam knocked and opened the door with the expression, and Emma said, "Tell her I'll be with her in 15 minutes, and went back to the subcontractor meeting and finished it at her own pace. When she came out to the lobby, Vanessa was sitting in one of the chairs near the window. She looked, for just a moment, like someone who had expected to be handled differently and wasn't quite sure what to do with having been made to wait. "Emma," she said, standing. "Vanessa." Emma stopped a few feet away. "You can't keep coming here." The directness of it seemed to land differently than anything she'd said before. Vanessa's face shifted through something. Irritation, recalibration, and something underneath both of those that Emma couldn't quite name, and then settled. "I have a right to—" "You don't have a right to walk into a private business and disrupt the workday." Emma kept her voice completely level. Not hard. Level. "You can call Ryan on his phone. You can't come here and expect me to stop working to manage whatever this is." "Whatever this is?" Vanessa's eyes sharpened. "Emma, I've known Ryan for 6 years. I know." Emma held her gaze. "And in those 6 years, Ryan is still running this company and still in this building, and you're still standing in the lobby hoping he'll come out of his office." She paused. "Think about what that means." Vanessa stared at her. "I'm not your enemy," Emma said. "I'm genuinely not. But I'm also not going to move out of the way because you'd prefer I wasn't here." She took a breath. "Please stop coming to the office." Pam, at the front desk, was looking at her monitor with the expression of someone who was going to remember this for a very long time. Vanessa left. She didn't say anything else. She walked out through the front door with her coat and her carefully constructed composure, and Emma watched her go and then turned back toward the hall. She had a 4 o'clock call with a vendor she needed to prep for. She went to her desk and opened her notes and started reading. Teresa's last day was a Friday in late April, and the office handled it the way offices handle these things. A cake in the break room, a card that circulated for 3 days and came back with 31 signatures and one smudged message that nobody claimed. A slightly awkward gathering around the conference table at 4:30, where people said things that were mostly true and occasionally generous. Teresa hugged Carol and shook Gerald's hand, and then came to find Emma in her office, which was the small room at the back of the building that had previously been used for storage and was now, through the quiet accumulation of her presence, recognizable as a workspace. I meant what I said, Teresa told her, standing in the doorway, about why I took the other offer. I know you did, Emma said. You made me feel like the financial side of this work was actually worth being good at. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, without decoration. I didn't feel that way before you got here. Emma stood up and shook her hand. You were already good at it. You just needed someone to ask the right questions. Teresa looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded and left. And Emma sat back down and looked at the half-finished restructuring plan on her desk and thought, briefly, that one of the harder things about building something was watching the people you'd built it with move on to build something else. Then she went back to work, because the residential division still needed a structural plan regardless of who was going to run it. Ryan hired a man named Patrick Crane to fill the role in May. Mid-40s, former project manager with a regional firm in Cincinnati, solid and methodical and not particularly imaginative, which was, Emma thought, probably the right thing for that role at this stage. She sat in on his interviews, which Ryan had asked her to do without making a formal announcement of it, and she gave her assessments in writing afterward, which Ryan read and factored in and occasionally pushed back on. And this had become, without any ceremony, the shape of how they made decisions together. She noticed things changing in Ryan by small degrees. He came to her more. Not for permission, he wasn't that kind of man, and she didn't want that dynamic, but for perspective. For the second read. He'd stop in her doorway at the end of the day sometimes and say, "Can I run something by you?" And she'd say yes, and he'd sit across from her and talk through whatever it was. And she'd ask questions and offer an angle he hadn't considered. And he'd nod and go away and come back. Having thought about it, and sometimes he'd tell her she'd been right, and sometimes he'd tell her he'd thought it through and disagreed. And both of those felt like the same thing, which was, he was taking her seriously. The kitchen table conversations deepened. They talked about more than work now. Not dramatically, not in a way either of them marked as significant, but the conversations had started to have more room in them. He told her about the project his father had almost lost in the early 90s, more detail than he'd given her before. What it had looked like from Ryan's perspective as a 12-year-old watching his father work 18-hour days and never explain why. She told him about the summer she'd spent after college working in her father's warehouse, learning the inventory system by hand, and how her father had been simultaneously proud and uncomfortable, like he wanted her there but also wanted better for her and couldn't reconcile those two things. Neither of them named what was accumulating between them. It was easier, and also somehow more honest, to just let it accumulate. What neither of them talked about directly was Vanessa. She hadn't come back to the office after March, but she hadn't disappeared. She'd simply moved her methods. She was present in other ways, in the occasional call that Ryan let go to voicemail and didn't mention unless Emma asked, in the way certain industry contacts sometimes looked at Emma at the few external events she'd attended with Ryan, with an expression that suggested they'd been given a particular version of the story before meeting her. Emma had learned to read those looks and give them nothing useful in return. In May, she learned something new about Vanessa from an unexpected direction. It came from Carol, who had a college roommate who worked in HR at a commercial real estate firm in Columbus. The roommate, Carol told Emma this over coffee in the break room, without preamble, as though she'd been holding it and decided today was the day to set it down, had mentioned that Vanessa had spent 2 years in Columbus before coming to the Westerville area, and that during those 2 years she'd been involved with the founder of a small development company in a way that had ended badly when certain financial irregularities surfaced. How badly? Emma asked. Badly enough that he settled out of court. Carol wrapped both hands around her cup. The roommate said she only knows because the HR file came through her department when the company did a claims review. Emma thought about this. Did she say what kind of irregularities? Expense accounts, joint business accounts that were used for personal purposes. Carol looked at her steadily. The kind of thing that's hard to prove cleanly and easier to pay to make go away. Emma held this information carefully, the way you hold something fragile before you know how much weight it can bear. She didn't say anything to Ryan about it right away. Not because she was keeping it from him, but because she wanted to understand what she actually had before she brought it into his living space. She spent a week thinking, and then, quietly, she started asking questions of her own. She didn't hire a private investigator. That felt like a step into a kind of warfare she didn't want to start. What she did was methodical and legal and unglamorous. She talked to people. Vendors who'd worked in the Columbus commercial real estate space. A woman she'd known from college who now worked at a title company and knew everyone worth knowing in the Mid-Ohio property market. An attorney, a contact from her days in Columbus, who specialized in contract disputes and knew, peripherally, the firm that had settled with someone in Vanessa's vicinity. She built another document. This one she kept at home, not at the office. May turned to June. The Bennett Company anniversary event was scheduled for the third weekend in June. 45 years in business, Richard's idea. A dinner at a venue in Columbus that had hosted the company's 30th and 35th anniversaries as well. Clients, investors, long-term subcontractors, key staff. About 120 people total. Emma had been involved in the planning for 6 weeks, not as the person with creative opinions about centerpieces, but as the person who'd noticed that the original venue contract had a catering escalation clause that would add roughly $8,000 to the final bill if the headcount exceeded 115 and had renegotiated it. Ryan had laughed when she'd told him. An actual laugh, full-throated. Of course you found the clause. It was on page 4. Nobody reads page 4. I read page 4. She'd looked at him. That's kind of my whole thing. He'd looked back at her, and something in his expression had done something that she'd filed away without quite examining. 2 weeks before the event, Vanessa called Ryan's cell phone on a Tuesday night. Emma was in the kitchen when it happened. Ryan was in the living room, and she heard his phone ring, heard the pause, heard him say, "I'll call you back," in the flat voice he used when he didn't mean it, and then heard him come into the kitchen. He set the phone on the counter, looked at it, then looked at Emma. "She wants to come to the anniversary dinner," he said. Emma set down what she was doing. "How does she know about it?" "She knows about most things that have to do with the company. She has—" He stopped. The particular quality of his stillness was different tonight, heavier. "She has contacts, people who talk to her." "Which people?" He shook his head, not refusing to answer, just the answer was more complicated than a list of names. "She's been part of the company's world for 6 years, Emma. That doesn't vanish because we got married. People have her number. They call her sometimes. Old habits." Emma looked at him. She had learned over the months to read the specific texture of his difficulty with Vanessa. The way it was never simple anger or simple grief, but something tangled, guilt and history, and something she still didn't fully understand knotted together in a way that he hadn't been able to put down. "What does she want?" Emma asked. "She said she wants to say goodbye properly." He said it like he knew how it sounded. "To the company, to the people she's known." "That's not what she wants." "I know." He picked up his phone, put it down again. "I know that's not what she wants." "Are you going to let her come?" Ryan stood at the counter for a long time. Emma waited. This was one of the things she'd learned about him. When he stood still and quiet like this, he wasn't being evasive. He was actually working something out, and rushing him only collapsed the working out into something less honest. "No," he said. "I'm going to tell her no." "Okay." "She won't accept it." "I know." He looked at her. "I need to tell you something." He said it with a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not hesitation, but the deliberateness of someone who has been carrying something and has finally decided the carrying is worse than the putting down. "There's a reason it's been hard for me to cut her off completely. It's not what you might think it is." Emma waited. "There was a project," he said, 8 years ago, before I was running the company. A contract we were bidding on, a large commercial project in the Columbus Metro, the kind of contract that would have set us up for 5 years. He was looking at the counter. There was another firm bidding against us, a firm that had connections we didn't, political relationships. We needed an edge. He stopped. Vanessa's father was on the selection committee. Emma held very still. "She introduced us," Ryan said. "Made the relationship happen. Her father, I think he genuinely liked the company. I think the work spoke for itself in the end, but she was the door." He finally looked up. "And afterward, she made sure I knew it. Not all at once. Gradually. The way you make sure someone knows something gradually so they can't point to the moment it became leverage. She told you she could undo it, Emma said. She told me her father had questions about the bidding process, that if certain things came out, if anyone looked too closely, it would embarrass the company. His jaw was tight. There was nothing actually improper. We won the bid legitimately, but the relationship existed. The introduction happened. In the right person's hands, in the wrong context, it could be made to look like something it wasn't. Emma was quiet for a moment. She thought about 6 years. She thought about the specific mechanics of what Vanessa had done. Not dramatic, not a single threat, but a slow accumulation of indebtedness and implied consequence until the debt felt like it had always been there, like part of the landscape. You've been afraid of what she'd say, Emma said, of what it would cost the company. My father built this. His voice was even but tight. He built it from nothing for 45 years. The idea that something I did, even something that wasn't wrong, could be used to... He stopped. I couldn't let her go because letting her go meant the threat was still out there. If she was close, I could manage it. Emma looked at him for a long time. She thought about the first meeting at the restaurant when he'd told her he didn't know what he was with Vanessa. She understood now that it had never been love. Or not only love, or not primarily love. It had been a leash. And the particular cruelty of a leash is that you forget after long enough what it felt like not to wear one. The document I've been building at home, Emma said. Ryan looked at her. About Vanessa's past? She held his gaze. I've been doing it for a month. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure what I had yet. She paused. I think what you just told me fills in a piece of it. He was very still. What did you find? I'll show you this weekend. She kept her voice measured. Not tonight. Tonight I just need you to know that you're not the only person she's done something like this to. And the pattern, the way she operates, leaves a record. She might not know that yet. Ryan looked at her for a long time. She watched the thing in him that had been tight start to shift, not release entirely but change quality, like a muscle that had been clenched so long it had forgotten what unclenching felt like, and was now beginning, carefully, to remember. Why are you doing this? He asked. Not like before, when the question had been skeptical. This time it was something else, something more unguarded. Emma thought about the right answer. There were several true ones. She gave him the truest. Because what she did to you was wrong, she said. And because this company deserves better than operating under somebody else's threat for the rest of its life. She paused. And because you've been honest with me when it was hard. I figure I should be the same. Ryan nodded. He didn't say thank you, which was the right choice because thank you would have made it smaller than it was. He just nodded, and they stood in the kitchen together in the quiet of a June evening. And after a while, Emma went back to what she'd been doing, and Ryan stayed at the counter, and they both occupied the same space without needing to fill it with anything else. The anniversary dinner was on a Saturday. The venue was a converted historic building on the north side of Columbus. Exposed brick, high ceilings, a main hall that had been used for every kind of event, from a sitting governor's fundraiser to a regional construction industry award ceremony. Richard had chosen it with the care he applied to most things, deliberately and without ostentation. Emma wore a dark green dress she'd bought the week before, not because she'd been anxious about what to wear, but because Carol had said, in the straightforward way Carol said things, "You should have something good for this. It matters more than you might think." She'd tried on 3 options in the dressing room and chosen the one that felt like herself rather than like an occasion, which Carol had approved of via a single text message that said, "Good choice." Ryan had looked at her when she came downstairs, not with the polite appreciation of a man who had been conditioned to respond correctly to his wife in formal clothes, but with a stillness that was different from his other stillnesses, a fraction longer, a different quality of attention. "You look good," he said. "So do you," she said, which was also true. He was better suited than she'd seen him, and he wore it with the ease of someone who'd grown up having to look presentable for clients and had made peace with that. They drove to Columbus together. Emma spent part of the drive going over the guest list in her head. She had met most of the major clients at this point, either in person or in the context of project discussions, and she knew enough about each of them to hold a real conversation rather than a polite one. Ryan drove and didn't talk much, which was his driving habit, and she'd learned to find this comfortable rather than strange. They arrived 40 minutes early, which was Richard's standard. The Bennetts were always there before their guests. Richard was already in the hall when they walked in, talking to the event coordinator, and he looked up when Emma entered and gave her a single nod that contained, in its brevity, something that might have been approval. The evening was good. Emma moved through it with the particular attention she'd brought to everything in the last 6 months, listening carefully, asking questions that were genuinely curious rather than performative, letting people talk about what they cared about rather than steering conversations where she needed them to go. She talked to Hector Rodriguez for 20 minutes about the concrete supply chain and what he was seeing in materials costs, and he told her she was the first person from a construction company he'd talked to at a dinner event who actually wanted to know the answer to that question. She talked to 3 long-term clients who each, in slightly different ways, said something to the effect that the company seemed to be operating with more coherence than they'd seen in the last couple of years. She was at the bar getting a glass of water when she saw Vanessa. She was standing near the entrance in a black dress, talking to a man Emma didn't immediately recognize. The recognition took a second because Emma had not expected her to be there. Ryan had told her no, and Emma had believed him. And then, in the second after recognition, came the particular cold clarity of understanding that Vanessa had come anyway. Emma didn't move immediately. She stood at the bar and looked across the room and let herself register what was happening without acting on the first impulse, which was to go find Ryan. She watched instead. Vanessa was talking to the man near the entrance with the practiced ease of someone who had attended enough of these events to know how to look like they belonged. She wasn't drawing attention to herself. Not yet. Emma found Ryan at a table near the center of the room, talking to 2 investors. She came to stand beside him and said quietly, when there was a pause in the conversation, "Vanessa is here." Ryan's expression didn't change outwardly, which she recognized as him managing it. The investors were looking at both of them. He excused himself smoothly. The practiced smoothness of someone who'd been managing business relationships since his early 20s, and turned to Emma. "Where?" "Near the entrance. Dark dress. She's talking to the man from the Westerville Municipal Planning Office. I don't know his name." Ryan looked. Emma watched him see her, watched the particular reaction move through his body, the tightening, the old conditioned response of someone who had spent years managing around a person rather than confronting them. "She came anyway," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I need to—" "Ryan," Emma kept her voice low and steady. "Don't go to her. Not first. Not tonight." He looked at Emma. "She's going to make a scene." "Maybe, but if you go to her, you're showing everyone in this room that she can still move you." She held his gaze. "Finish your conversations. Let her be the one who acts first." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. They lasted 20 minutes before Vanessa moved. She worked the room with the confidence of someone who knew most of these people, because she did. 6 years of events, introductions, the subtle accumulation of connections. She greeted people warmly. People greeted her back, some warmly, some with the cautious warmth of people who'd noticed the new arrangement and weren't sure of the protocol. And then she came toward the center of the room, toward the table where Emma was standing with Carol and Gerald and 2 of the firm's major clients, and she said, in a voice pitched precisely to be heard by the nearest 10 people without appearing to be aimed at anyone, "Emma, I was hoping I'd see you tonight. I wanted to talk to you about the residential division restructuring." The table went quiet. Carol's expression became very careful. Gerald looked at the tablecloth. Emma looked at Vanessa. "Now isn't really the time, Vanessa." "Of course," she smiled. "I just think, given my involvement with the company over the years, it might be worth—" "Vanessa." Emma kept her voice completely level. Not cold, not sharp. Level. "You don't have an involvement with this company. You're a guest at a dinner you weren't invited to." The table went very still. One of the clients, a man named Arthur Helm, who had been working with Bennett Construction for 12 years and had a face that showed nothing when he wanted it to, was looking between them with an expression of focused attention. Vanessa's smile sharpened slightly. "That's a little direct. You came to a company event you were specifically asked not to attend, Emma said. I don't think direct is the wrong register. Ryan and I have a relationship that goes back. I know how far it goes back. Emma looked at her steadily. The room around them had expanded slightly. More people were aware of this exchange now, their attention shifting without most of them moving. I also know about Garrett Mills. Vanessa went still. The development company in Columbus, Emma said. I know about the settlement. I know about the joint accounts. She kept her voice even, almost quiet. She wasn't performing. She wasn't raising the temperature. She was just saying what was true. I know about the pattern. That has nothing to do with that. And I know what you told Ryan about his father's contract 8 years ago. Emma watched Vanessa's face change. The smile disappeared entirely. What was underneath it was harder to read. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of someone who has spent years controlling the information in a room and is realizing for the first time that they are not the most informed person in it. What you implied. What you let him believe you could do. Vanessa said nothing. That's called coercion, Emma said. It's quieter than what people usually imagine coercion to look like, but that's what it is. The silence at the table and in the immediate vicinity was complete. Arthur Helm was looking at Emma with an expression that had moved past careful attention into something that looked like reassessment. Carol had her hands flat on the table. Gerald was not looking at the tablecloth anymore. Vanessa's composure reassembled itself, though with visible effort. You have no idea what you're talking about. I have documentation, Emma said. I'm not going to go through it here. This isn't the place. She held Vanessa's gaze. But I want you to know that I have it, and I want you to think about what it would mean for the Columbus settlement, for the people involved, if someone were to connect the pattern across the different situations. She paused. I think you're a smart person. I think you know what I'm describing. Vanessa looked at her for a long moment. Something was moving behind her eyes. Calculation, primarily, and underneath the calculation something that looked like it might have been, at the base of it, exhaustion. Then she turned and left. She walked through the room and out through the hall entrance without speaking to anyone else, and the sound of her heels on the floor faded, and the people around Emma's table let out a collective breath that was not quite audible but was unmistakably there. Arthur Helm said, after a moment, I'm going to get another drink. Can I bring anyone anything? Carol said, Gin and tonic, thank you. And that was how the moment ended. Emma stood at the table and felt her own heartbeat gradually return to normal. Her hands were steady, which she was grateful for. Inside, she was less steady than she appeared, and she was aware of that, and she chose not to show it because the showing would serve no purpose. Ryan appeared at her shoulder. She didn't know how long he'd been there. She hadn't seen him come back, but from the look on his face, he'd been close enough to hear. He didn't say anything right away. They stood together at the edge of the table while the room resumed its noise around them, and he looked at the entrance where Vanessa had gone, and then he looked at Emma. You told her about the Mills settlement, he said. Yes? How much do you actually have? Enough. She met his eyes. Not everything, but enough that she knows she can't be certain what I have and what I don't. He was quiet. You took a risk. I know. She held his gaze. I thought it was worth it. He looked at her with the full attention, the complete kind. You didn't tell me you were going to do that. No, because you would have worried, and the worrying would have shown. She paused. You needed to be able to be surprised. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't entirely name. It was complicated. It had several things in it at once, and they weren't all comfortable things. Emma, not here, she said quietly. Later. He nodded. They turned back to the room, and Arthur Helm returned with drinks, and the anniversary dinner of Bennett Family Construction, 45 years in business, resumed around them with the particular warmth of an evening that had survived its interruption and come out the other side of it with something clarified. Richard found Emma near the end of the night. The room was thinning, people gathering coats, exchanging goodbyes, the particular winding down energy of an event that had gone well. He came to stand beside her at the edge of the room and looked out at the remaining guests without preamble. Pam told me about the lobby conversations, he said. The ones you had with Vanessa, over the winter. Emma looked at him. Pam doesn't miss much. No. He was quiet for a moment. I heard some of what you said tonight. I know. Garrett Mills. He said the name with the flat affect of someone to whom the name was not new. I heard that name 2 years ago. Different context. I never connected it. Emma looked at him. Did you look into it? Not closely enough. He turned to look at her directly. You connected it. Carol's contact connected it. I just followed the thread. Richard was quiet. Outside the high windows of the hall, the Columbus night did what it does in June. Stayed light later than you expected, a particular kind of lavender gray at the edges. Ryan told you, he said. About the contract. Tonight, yes. I didn't know she'd done that. His voice was even, but something in it had gone tight. I knew she'd been a problem for years. I didn't know the specific shape of it. He was protecting you, Emma said. He didn't want you to know that something connected to the company might be used against it. Richard stood with this for a moment. The tight thing in his voice didn't go away, but it changed quality, shifted from something like anger into something more like grief. He's been carrying that for 8 years. Yes. Because of me. A pause. Because of what I built. Because he loves what you built, Emma said. She looked at Richard steadily. That's not a character flaw. It's just he needed someone to stand next to him in it. He didn't have that. Richard looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with the economy of a man who did not give things like this easily, he has it now. Emma held his gaze. She didn't say anything. She just nodded, once, and they stood together in the thinning room and let the statement settle where it had landed. Ryan found her near the coat check at the end of the night. Most of the guests were gone. A few staff members were folding tablecloths. The venue had taken on the particular quality of a space that had held something and was now releasing it, settling back into itself. He stood beside her and helped her with her coat, which was a gesture so ordinary that she almost missed the particular way he did it, carefully, attentively, like it was something that deserved to be done right. They walked out to the parking lot without talking. The night was warm the way June nights in Ohio sometimes are, with enough humidity to make the air feel close, and the parking lot lights had that soft haze quality from the moisture. Ryan got to the car and opened the passenger door, which he'd done before, but which felt tonight like a different gesture than it usually did. She got in. He came around and got in the driver's side and sat for a moment without starting the car. I need to say something, he said. Emma waited. He stopped, started again. I've been running this company and running my life inside a constraint I accepted so long ago, I stopped seeing it as a constraint. I just thought that was how things were. He was looking straight ahead through the windshield at the parking lot, at nothing in particular. And you walked in, and in 6 months you changed the payment process and the maintenance cycle and the division structure, and you built a case against someone who'd been running me in circles for 8 years. He stopped. And you did all of it without once making me feel like you were doing it to prove something to me. Emma listened. I don't know how to... He turned to look at her. I don't know how to do this. Whatever this is, I haven't known how to do it since December, and I've been... His jaw worked. I've been waiting to figure it out, and I'm not sure waiting is the right strategy anymore. Emma looked at him in the dim light of the parking lot. He was not a man who said things like this easily or often. She could see the effort in the set of his face, the cost of it. Ryan, she said, you don't have to have it figured out. I feel like I owe you. You don't owe me anything. She said it clearly. That's not what this is. She held his gaze. I didn't do any of this for credit. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because... She paused and gave him the honest version, because somewhere in the middle of all of it, I started to care what happened, to the company, to you. She paused. Both of those things. Ryan looked at her. The parking lot was quiet. A car pulled out somewhere behind them, its headlights sweeping briefly across the windshield, and then it was gone and they were in the quiet again. Both of those things, he repeated. Yes. He nodded slowly. Not quickly, not with relief, but with the deliberateness of someone taking something in at the pace it deserved. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the center console, and it was not a romantic gesture in the conventional sense. It was simpler than that, and heavier, the gesture of two people who had come through something together and were taking stock of what they were still holding. Emma turned her hand over so their palms were together, and he didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything. And they sat in the parking lot of the venue in the June night, with the weight of what had happened settling around them and between them. And after a long moment, Ryan started the car, and they drove home through the Columbus streets, in a silence that had changed quality entirely from the silence that had accompanied them on the way there. She looked out the window at the city going past, at the ordinary nighttime business of streetlights and intersections and people living their lives in the lit windows of apartment buildings. And she thought about Vanessa's face at the moment she'd understood what Emma knew, the exhaustion she'd seen under the calculation. There had been something genuinely sad in it, though Emma wasn't going to reach for that thought too readily. Sadness didn't excuse what Vanessa had done, didn't make it anything other than what it was. But it was there. She'd seen it. She thought about what Richard had said. He has it now. She looked at Ryan's profile as he drove. He was watching the road with the steady attention he brought to most things, and his hand was still near hers on the console, not touching now but close. She thought, this is the part that comes before whatever comes next. Not a resolution, not an arrival, just the end of one kind of difficulty and the beginning of figuring out what you do with the space it leaves. That was enough for tonight. The drive home from Columbus took 40 minutes, and they spent most of it in the kind of quiet that had stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like its own kind of presence. Ryan kept both hands on the wheel after the first 10 minutes. Emma watched the highway lights go past and thought about what came next, which was her habit. Not anxiety exactly, but the forward-facing orientation of someone who had learned that the moment after something resolves is also the moment when you have to decide what you're going to build in the space it leaves. What came next, practically speaking, was the documentation. She had shown Ryan the folder on a Sunday 2 days after the dinner. They'd sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd eaten most of their meals together, where they'd built the residential division restructuring plan, where the shape of their working relationship had quietly established itself over 6 months, and she'd walked him through what she had. Not with drama, just methodically, page by page, the way she approached most things. The Garrett Mills connection was the strongest piece. Carol's contact had given Emma a name, a paralegal who'd worked at the firm that handled the settlement, and Emma had, through careful and entirely legal channels, confirmed the basic shape of what had happened. Vanessa had been in a relationship with the founder of a small Columbus development company named Garrett Mills for approximately 18 months. During that time, a joint business account used for project expenses had been drawn down by roughly $60,000 in transactions that, on paper, looked like vendor payments and, in practice, were not. When Mills discovered the discrepancy, he'd confronted Vanessa. She had, according to the paralegal's account, responded with a counter-threat involving personal communications that would have been damaging if made public. Mills had settled for silence rather than prosecution, paid his attorney fees, and spent the next 2 years quietly telling anyone he trusted not to get into business with her. The pattern was the thing. A single incident could be disputed, contextualized, explained away. A pattern was harder to manage. The second piece was what Ryan had told her at the dinner. The story about the contract, Vanessa's father on the selection committee, the 8-year thread of implied threat that had never been pulled but had never been put away either. Emma had written it down after Ryan told her, carefully, with dates where she had them and approximations where she didn't. Ryan had read her version of it and made 2 corrections and then sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment and said nothing. The third piece was smaller but useful. 3 instances over the past 18 months where Vanessa had represented herself to external parties as having an ongoing advisory relationship with Bennett Family Construction. The call Richard had mentioned to a client. A second instance Emma had found through a vendor contact. Vanessa had called a material supplier inquiring about Bennett's account status, identifying herself as a company representative. A third where she'd attended an industry networking event and introduced herself to 2 attendees using Ryan's name as an affiliation. None of these were felonies. Together, they described a person who had been operating in a space between relationship and leverage for years and who had become gradually less careful about the line between the two. Ryan had looked at the full document for a long time. Emma had let him look. She'd made coffee and sat across from him and not tried to fill the space. She could deny most of this, he said. Yes. The mill's settlement is sealed. We can't use it formally. I know. I'm not planning to use it formally. She held his gaze. I'm planning to use it the way she's used things, as something she knows I know, as a shape in the room. He understood what she was saying. He'd seen Vanessa operate this way for years. The things she knew, the things she might say, the implied consequence that was never quite made explicit because explicit consequences had edges you could argue with. Emma was describing a version of the same method, not as retaliation, but as a counterweight. You're not comfortable with this, Emma said. It wasn't a question. Not entirely. He set the document down. It feels like her. Yes. He met her eyes. I don't want to operate like her. Emma thought about this carefully. There's a difference, she said, between using information to threaten someone into silence and using information to establish that you see the full picture of what's been happening. She paused. I'm not going to threaten her with exposure. I'm going to make clear that the thing she's been relying on, the idea that nobody has looked closely enough to see the pattern, is no longer true. She kept her voice even. What she does with that information is her choice. I'm just changing the conditions. Ryan was quiet for a long time, then, and if she doesn't respond to that, then we consider other options, but I think she will. Emma looked at him steadily. I think she's been operating on the assumption that nobody would ever have the patience to build the case. She relies on people not wanting the mess of confronting her. She paused. I don't mind the mess. Ryan looked at her. Something in his expression had the quality it got when he was deciding whether to say the thing he was thinking, and then he said it. I know you don't. He said it simply, without irony. That's one of the things He stopped. Then, carefully, that's one of the things about you. Emma held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, Do you want to be in the room when I talk to her? Or would you rather not be? I want to be there. Okay. They contacted Vanessa through Ryan's attorney. A measured letter that said, in the formal language of attorneys, that certain matters had come to the company's attention regarding representations made to third parties, and that the principals of Bennett Family Construction wished to discuss these matters at a mutually convenient time. The letter did not threaten. It did not list specifics. It simply established that a conversation was being requested and that the company was prepared to have it. Vanessa's attorney called back within 48 hours. The meeting was set for a Thursday morning in the second week of July at the attorney's office in Westerville, neutral ground, or as neutral as any ground gets in these situations. Emma had spent the intervening week not obsessing, which took active maintenance, and Ryan had spent it quieter than usual, which she'd come to understand was his version of the same thing. The night before the meeting, he came into the kitchen where she was standing at the counter going through some notes, and he stopped in the doorway and said, Are you all right? She looked up. I'm fine. Are you? I've been thinking about something. He came in and sat at the table. About what I'm going to feel like tomorrow. After. Emma set down her notes. What do you mean? I've been carrying this for 8 years. He said it without self-pity, just accurately, the way he described anything structural. The thing with the contract, her father, the implied... He paused. The implied debt. I've been so focused on getting out from under it that I haven't really thought about what I'm going to feel like when it's gone. Emma sat down across from him. What do you think you'll feel? He thought about it, actually thought, not reflexively. I don't know. That's what I mean. He looked at her. I've been angry at her, but I've also been, he chose the word with visible care, responsible, like it was my fault for letting it get that far. It wasn't your fault, Emma said. I know. I'm starting to know that. He looked at the table. It's taking longer to actually feel it than to know it. Emma thought about her father at the kitchen table with the bank notices. about the way he'd kept the debt from her for 2 years because he felt responsible for something that had been partly bad luck, partly bad timing, and only partly decisions he'd made. About how long it had taken him to look at her without the particular quality of shame that comes from having let someone you love see you struggling. "That's how it works," she said. "Knowing comes first. Feeling catches up eventually." He looked at her for a moment. "How do you know?" "Because I've watched someone I love go through it." She held his gaze. "It takes as long as it takes. You can't rush it." He nodded. He reached across the table and picked up her hand, not urgently, but with the same deliberateness he'd shown in the parking lot after the dinner, the gesture of someone paying attention to what they were doing. Emma looked at their hands on the kitchen table and thought about December, about the notepad on the counter that first morning, about 6 months of kitchen table conversations that had built something neither of them had exactly planned. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Ryan said, "I want you to know that I'm glad you're here, for real, not as a—" He stopped. "Not as a contract." Emma turned her hand over under his. "I know," she said. "I'm glad too." They sat at the kitchen table for a while longer, not talking, which was its own kind of conversation by now. And then Emma went back to her notes and Ryan made himself something to eat, and they moved around the kitchen in the particular ease of two people who have learned each other's rhythms without making a formal study of them. The attorney's office was a third-floor suite in a professional building downtown. The kind of office that was designed to feel neutral and ended up feeling exactly like what it was, which was a space built for difficult conversations to be managed in. Vanessa arrived with her own attorney, a woman named Kessler, who had the precise, contained energy of someone who billed by the hour and intended to earn it. Emma had brought the document folder. She set it on the table in front of her without opening it. Vanessa looked different than she had at the anniversary dinner. She was dressed with the same care, but something in the quality of her composure had changed. It was intact, but effortful now, in a way it hadn't been before. Emma recognized the effort because she'd felt it herself, in the lobby in January, in the parking lot with the coffee cup, all the time she'd had to hold something steady that wanted to move. Ryan sat beside Emma. His attorney, a man named Forrester, who had handled Bennett Company legal matters for a decade, sat at the end of the table. Kessler opened. She said with professional efficiency that her client was prepared to discuss the matters referenced in the letter and wished to understand what specific concerns the company had. Ryan's attorney said that the company had documented instances in which Vanessa had represented herself to third parties as having an ongoing relationship with Bennett Family Construction, and that these representations were inaccurate and had the potential to damage the company's relationships with vendors and clients. Kessler said that her client denied making any representations that could reasonably be construed as, "There are 3 instances," Emma said. She opened the folder and put the relevant pages on the table. A phone call to Meridian Supply on April 14th, an introduction at the Ohio Construction Network event on May 2nd, a call to client Arthur Helms' firm in March. She looked at Kessler, not at Vanessa. "They're documented. The first 2 are confirmed by the parties involved. Mr. Helms' call was relayed to Ryan directly." Kessler looked at the pages. Vanessa looked at them too, and Emma watched her read and watched her understand the quality of what was in front of her. "Additionally," Emma continued, "we have Ryan's account of a conversation that occurred approximately 8 years ago in which Vanessa represented that she could create reputational damage to the company through her relationship with her father, who was at that time a member of a contract selection committee." She kept her voice even. No heat. "We have that account in writing." "That's a characterization of a private conversation," Kessler said. "It's Ryan's account of his own experience," Emma said. "He was there." A pause. "There are also," Emma said, and she kept her voice exactly level for this part, "certain patterns in Ms. Brooks's history with previous business relationships that suggest a consistent approach to these kinds of arrangements." She did not open the section of the folder with the Mills documentation. She just put her hand on it. "We're not here to litigate those. They're not our business, but they inform our understanding of the situation." Vanessa was looking at Emma's hand on the folder. Emma could see her thinking, could see the calculation running, the assessment of what Emma actually had versus what she might have, the particular arithmetic of someone deciding whether to call a bluff or decide it isn't one. "What do you want?" Vanessa said. She said it directly, past her attorney, which made Kessler's expression tighten, but it was the first real thing she'd said in the room, and Emma respected it more than the managed statements. I want you to stop representing yourself as connected to this company, Emma said. I want you to stop contacting our clients, our vendors, and our staff. She paused. And I want you to release whatever you've been holding over Ryan. Vanessa looked at her. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. Emma held her gaze without aggression, without heat, just steadily. The contract situation 8 years ago, whatever you've been letting him believe you could do with it, I want that released. She paused. Not because I'm asking you to apologize. I don't need an apology. I need the thing to be over. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Something was moving in her expression, complex, layered. Emma had thought, in the weeks of preparation for this conversation, about what Vanessa might actually be feeling underneath the management of all of it. She'd come to the conclusion that Vanessa was someone who had learned early that proximity to powerful things was safer than building something of her own, and who had spent years constructing that proximity with great skill and had never noticed, or never let herself notice, that what she'd built was not a life. It was a position. And positions required constant maintenance in a way that lives didn't. She didn't say any of this. It wasn't the right room for it. If I agree to what you're describing, Vanessa said, and those documents, stay in the folder, Emma said. I have no interest in using them against you. I never did. She looked at Vanessa directly. I just need you to understand that I have them, that I looked, that the things you've been relying on people not knowing, I know them. Kessler was looking at Emma with the careful attention of a professional assessing a situation that had moved into territory she hadn't fully anticipated. Ryan's attorney, Forrester, had said almost nothing for the last 10 minutes, because there was almost nothing for him to say. Ryan spoke for the first time. He'd been sitting beside Emma in the silence of someone who had decided, before coming here, that he was going to let her lead this and not undermine that decision by filling the space. But he spoke now, quietly and directly. Vanessa, I need this to be done. Vanessa looked at him. The sharpness in her expression softened slightly. Not into warmth, but into something more complicated. Emma watched them look at each other and did not look away, because she was not afraid of what was in that look. She understood it. 6 years was 6 years, and the end of a long thing, even a long thing that had been wrong, had its own particular weight. I know, Vanessa said, and she said it to Ryan, not to Emma, and it was the most honest thing she'd said in the room. The agreement was drafted over the following week by the attorneys. It was formal but not adversarial, an acknowledgement that Vanessa would cease representing any affiliation with Bennett Family Construction, that she would not contact company clients, vendors, or staff, and that both parties agreed to consider the matters discussed closed. Ryan's attorney included a clause about the contract situation, not naming it explicitly, but establishing in careful legal language that the company considered any implied obligations related to past introductions or business referrals fully discharged. Vanessa signed it on a Tuesday. Emma wasn't there when she signed it. Ryan wasn't either. The attorneys handled the exchange, which was probably the right way to end something that had needed to end for years. Ryan called Emma from the car afterward. She was at the office. He said, "It's done." Emma stood at her desk and held the phone and said, "How do you feel?" A pause. "Lighter," he said. "It's..." Another pause. "It's like something I'd stopped noticing was there is just gone." "That's what you said would happen." "I said I didn't know what would happen." "You said you thought you'd feel lighter." He was quiet for a moment. "I guess I did." She could hear something in his voice that she'd been hearing more frequently in recent weeks. A looseness, a quality of ease that she associated with the version of him that laughed at his cousin's joke at the wedding dinner. It was showing up more often now, in small moments. She'd noticed without making a production of it. "I'm going to stop at the site before I come in. Gerald wants to walk the Marysville job." "Okay. I'll be in by noon." "I'll be here." He paused. "Emma." "Yeah." "Thank you." She thought about telling him again that he didn't need to thank her, but he did need to say it, and she understood the difference. "You're welcome," she said, and meant it. The summer moved differently after that. Emma noticed it in the way you notice a change in pressure. Not dramatically, not all at once, but as a gradual shift in the quality of the air. The office had been running well since spring. Now it ran with something additional, which was the absence of a background anxiety that had been so present for so long that people had absorbed it without knowing they had. Gerald was the first to name it, which surprised her. He came into her office one afternoon in late July and sat down across from her desk, something he'd never done before, always preferring to catch her in the hallway or break room in the way of people who conduct important conversations sideways, and said, "The guys on the Marysville site asked me if something changed." Emma looked up. "What did they say, specifically?" "They said Ryan seemed different. More, they used the word settled." Gerald said it like he was quoting something from a foreign language. "I didn't have a good answer for them." "What did you tell them?" "That the company had resolved some external matters." He paused. "Which is true." "Yes." Gerald looked at her for a moment. He had the expression he sometimes wore when he was adjusting an assessment he'd already made. Not comfortable, but honest. "When you first got here," he said, "I thought you were going to be in the way." Emma waited. "You weren't in the way," he said. It came out the same way his acknowledgement about the payment fix had come out. Heavy, like putting something down. "You were in exactly the right place." Emma held his gaze. "Thank you, Gerald. That means something." He nodded and stood up and left, and she listened to his footsteps go down the hall and thought about how long it had taken him to say that, and how much it was worth precisely because of how long it had taken. Patrick Crane, who had taken Teresa's position in May, was finding his footing. He was not Teresa. He was more methodical, less instinctive, the kind of person who needed the process laid out before he could move confidently within it. But Emma had come to think that this was what the residential division needed at this particular stage. She spent 2 mornings a week with him going through the numbers, asking the same kind of questions she'd asked Teresa, and he responded to the questions differently than Teresa had. Where Teresa had been waiting to say things she'd been holding, Patrick needed the questions to help him find what he knew. Different skill, same outcome. In August, the company landed a significant new contract, a mixed-use development in Delaware County, the largest single contract Bennett Family Construction had signed in 4 years. Ryan told her over dinner, and his face when he told her had that quality of someone who was allowing themselves to actually feel good about something rather than immediately calculating the risk. "Arthur Helm recommended us," he said. Emma set down her fork. "Helm?" He called the developer directly, said the company's management was the strongest he'd seen in the current market. Ryan was looking at her with an expression that was difficult to read precisely because it had several things in it that weren't competing, just present together. He specifically mentioned, and this is his language, not mine, that the company had demonstrated real institutional stability in recent months. Emma thought about Arthur Helm at the anniversary dinner, watching the exchange between her and Vanessa with careful attention. Reassessing. "He saw something he trusted," she said. "He saw you handle something he trusted." Ryan kept her gaze. "There's a difference." She looked back at him. She thought about the note on the kitchen counter in December. The cold bed, the 7 months between then and now, the whiteboard diagrams and the break room conversations, and the parking lot in June and the attorney's office in July. The accumulation of it. "We both handled it," she said. He nodded slowly. "Yeah." A pause. "We did." They ate dinner, and the evening was ordinary in the way evenings had become ordinary. Not empty, not performative, just the texture of 2 people who had built a shared rhythm and were living inside it. After dinner, Ryan did the dishes, which he'd started doing sometime in June without either of them formalizing it, and Emma sat at the kitchen table with her laptop going over the preliminary numbers on the Delaware County contract, and the house had the particular quiet of late August, when the days are still long but starting to give back a little of their light at the edges. Her parents came to visit the 3rd weekend in August. This was the first time her mother and father had come to Westerville since the wedding, and Emma had felt, in the days before their arrival, a kind of anticipatory anxiety that she recognized as the particular nervousness of having two different versions of your life meet each other. Her parents knew the shape of the arrangement. Her mother had known from the beginning, and her father had figured it out in the way fathers figure things out when they're paying attention. But what they hadn't seen was what the arrangement had become, which was something harder to explain and easier to demonstrate. Ryan had taken the Friday off. He'd cleaned the house in the morning, which Emma had noticed without commenting on because it seemed important to let him do it without making it a conversation. He'd also bought groceries. Real groceries, the kind that required a plan, and had told her somewhat awkwardly that he thought he'd make dinner Friday night. "You cook?" Emma had said, because she'd genuinely never seen him do it. "I cook a few things," he'd said, defensive in the mild way of someone who knows their position is not strong. "Pasta, chicken, one soup." "Which soup?" "Just a soup. Don't look at me like that." She'd looked at him exactly like that. He'd made the soup anyway on Friday evening, and it was actually good, a chicken vegetable with enough seasoning to suggest he'd been making it long enough to stop following a recipe. And her mother had eaten 2 bowls and said so, which had visibly pleased Ryan in a way he tried to make look like nothing. Her father had watched Ryan through dinner with the particular attention of a man who has given something valuable away and needs to know it went to the right place. Not hostile, just attentive. The kind of attention that Emma had grown up on the receiving end of and had learned to read like a second language. After dinner, when her mother and Emma were in the kitchen and Ryan and her father had drifted onto the back porch with their coffee, Emma could see them through the window. She couldn't hear what they were saying. Her father was talking, Ryan was listening, and then Ryan was talking, and her father was nodding with the particular quality of a man updating an assessment. At one point, her father said something and Ryan laughed. The full, easy laugh she'd first heard at the wedding and had been hearing more of. And her father smiled, and Emma looked away because watching it too directly felt like standing too close to something. "He's good," her mother said. She was drying a dish and not looking at Emma, which was her method for saying important things. "I don't mean that casually. I mean, I can see that he's a good person." "He is," Emma said. "When you first told us about the arrangement," her mother paused, choosing words, "I was worried that you were doing it for us and not for yourself." Emma looked at her mother. "I did do it for you." "I know." A pause. "I just wasn't sure that was going to be enough to make a real life out of." Emma thought about what she could say that was accurate. "It started as that," she said. "It's not only that now." Her mother looked at her for a moment. Then she went back to drying the dish. "Good," she said, simply, as if that was the only word it needed. Her parents left Sunday afternoon. Ryan stood with Emma in the driveway and waved until their car turned out of the street, and then they stood for a moment in the driveway in the Sunday quiet. "Your father told me something," Ryan said. Emma looked at him. "He said—" Ryan stopped, and he had an expression that was difficult to read, which meant it was the honest one. "He said that when the debt was cleared, he felt ashamed, not relieved, ashamed, because he'd needed help." Emma was quiet. "He said it took him a long time to stop feeling that and start feeling grateful." Ryan looked at her. "He said the person who helped him stop was you, because you never once made him feel like the debt was the thing. You made him feel like the thing was getting through it." Emma looked at the empty street where her parents' car had gone. She felt something tighten in her chest. Not pain, just the particular pressure of something that mattered being named. "He said that," she said. "He did." Ryan paused. "I thought you should know." She stood in the driveway for another moment. Then she took a breath and let it out slowly, and Ryan stood beside her and let her do it, and that was exactly right. September came in with a shift in the air. The first real suggestion of fall, the mornings with a new edge to them, the afternoons still warm but with a quality of light that had changed angle. The Delaware County project moved from contract to active planning, and Emma threw herself into the financial modeling for it with the particular focus she brought to problems that were genuinely complex. It was a different scale than anything she'd done at the company so far, and she felt the difference the way you feel the difference when a task stops being something you can manage from habit and starts being something that requires your whole mind. Patrick was better on this project than she'd expected. He had a methodical quality that served complex planning well, and he'd grown more confident over the summer in the particular way of people who've had their competence respected and have started to trust it themselves. They worked well together, which was something Emma hadn't assumed going in and was glad to find true. Ryan was on the planning calls for the Delaware County project in a different way than he'd been present for previous projects, more engaged, less reactive. He asked better questions and absorbed the answers with the focus of someone who was no longer dividing his attention between the work and whatever low-grade anxiety had been occupying the background of his mind for years. Gerald noticed this before Emma did. He mentioned it to her in the break room in mid-September, which was the third time he'd sought her out directly for a conversation, which was 3 times more than in the entire previous decade based on Carol's account. "He's present," Gerald said, like that was a technical term. "On the sites, in the meetings, he's—" Gerald appeared to be looking for a word that wasn't going to sound sentimental, which was a constraint she respected. "He's actually there." "Yes," Emma said. "He is." Gerald looked at her with the expression she'd come to understand as his version of directness, which was not a soft thing at all. "You did that?" "We did that," Emma said. Gerald made a noise that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement and went back to his office, which was its own kind of acknowledgement from a man who had been built on a foundation of not giving them easily. The company's quarterly numbers for Q3 were the best since the fourth quarter 3 years earlier. Not dramatically. It wasn't a turnaround story in the sense of a graph going suddenly vertical. It was the kind of improvement that comes from a dozen small things working better and a few medium things being fixed and 1 or 2 large problems being removed. Emma wrote the summary herself and sent it to Richard before sending it to the wider leadership group, and Richard called her the same afternoon. "The maintenance savings are real," he said. "Gerald's numbers." "Gerald's execution," Emma said. "The scheduling was mine." "I know." A pause. "Emma, I want to have lunch." "Of course." "Not about the numbers." Another pause, and in the pause something that was unusual from Richard, which was the quality of someone choosing words with care rather than simply having them. "I want to talk to you about the future of the company, the structure, what I'm thinking about." He paused again. "And what I'd want your role to be in it." Emma stood at her desk with the phone and felt something settle. Not triumph, not vindication. Just the particular quiet that comes when something you work toward arrives in the shape you work toward without the fanfare you'd feared would make it feel like something else. "I'd like that," she said. They had lunch the following Friday. Richard ordered the soup, same as the first time, and looked at her with the same steadiness and talked about the next 5 years, where he wanted the company to be, what the transition of leadership was going to require, the structural questions that needed answering before they could get there. He talked about the Delaware County project and the residential division and the equipment fleet and the staffing gaps that still existed in the field supervisor tier. And then he talked about the role he thought Emma should formally hold going forward. Not Ryan's wife, not the woman in the back office who'd fixed the payment process. A title, a defined scope, a seat at the table that reflected what she'd actually been doing for 9 months without one. Emma listened to all of it. When Richard finished, she sat with it for a moment. "I need to talk to Ryan," she said. Richard nodded. "Of course." "Not because I need his permission." She held Richard's gaze. "Because this affects both of us, and I'm not going to make a decision about it without talking to him first." Richard looked at her steadily. Then he said, "That's the right answer." She talked to Ryan that night, at the kitchen table. She told him what Richard had said, all of it, and Ryan listened in his way, completely, without interrupting. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What do you want to do?" "I think I want to say yes," Emma said. "I want to know what you think." "I think—" He paused, and she watched him find the accurate thing. "I think it's exactly what it should be. You being there formally instead of just—" He stopped. "Instead of just being there," she finished. "Yes." He met her eyes. "I want you there formally." A pause. "I want you there in every way." He said it simply, without theater. The kind of thing that comes out cleanly when someone has stopped managing what they allow themselves to say. Emma looked at him across the kitchen table where they'd built most of what they had. She thought about December, about the note on the counter, about 7 months of choosing to stay and choosing to work, and choosing, gradually, without announcing it, to care. "Okay," she said. He reached across the table. She met his hand halfway. Outside, September was doing what September does in Ohio, cooling at the edges, the days still holding light but letting it go a little earlier each evening, the particular quality of a season making room for the one behind it. Emma thought about her father's warehouse, about the curtains her mother had sewn, about 23 employees and a December ceremony and a notepad on a kitchen counter. She thought about all the distance between that morning and this one. It was a long distance. She'd covered most of it on foot, which was the only way you actually covered any distance that mattered. The formal title came through in October, Chief Operating Officer, Bennett Family Construction, effective the 1st of the month. Richard had insisted on the full title rather than something softer, something that gestured at the role without naming it directly. He was not a man who gestured at things. He said what he meant and put it in writing and signed it, and that was the end of the discussion about what to call it. Emma had sat at her desk the morning the paperwork was finalized and looked at the document for a moment without performing anything about it. No relief, no triumph, none of the emotions she'd imagined feeling when something like this arrived. What she actually felt was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a thing being named accurately, of the world catching up to a fact that had been true for some months before anyone wrote it down. Carol brought her coffee that morning without being asked, which was not something Carol did, and set it on Emma's desk and said, "About time," and walked back out. Emma held the coffee cup and felt for just a moment the particular warmth of being seen by someone who had watched closely and waited and now simply confirmed what they'd known. The weeks that followed were full in the way October is full. The Delaware County project moving into its active phase, the equipment fleet scheduled for its winter maintenance cycle, the Q4 planning cycle beginning with the particular urgency of a company that had learned what it cost to let planning slide. Emma moved through all of it with the focused attention she'd brought to everything since December, but with a different quality now. Less like someone proving they belonged and more like someone who knew they did, which changed the texture of the work without changing the work itself. Ryan was different too, in ways that accumulated rather than announced themselves. He started sleeping better, which Emma knew because the quality of the mornings changed. He was less guarded at breakfast, more willing to be in a conversation before he'd fully assembled himself for the day, which was when you found out who a person actually was in the margins of their own performance. He talked about the Delaware County project with a forward-looking energy that she hadn't seen from him on previous projects. The energy of someone who wasn't managing a threat while also trying to build something but was, for the first time in years, just building. He also, gradually, stopped talking about Vanessa. Not in a deliberate or pointed way. There was no moment where he announced that he was done with it. She simply noticed, over the weeks of October, that the topic had stopped appearing, that the voicemails he didn't return were from other people now, that when certain music played that she'd learned was associated with a particular period of his life, he no longer left the room. She mentioned it to him once, obliquely, on a Saturday morning when they were both in the kitchen at the same time, a weekend morning, unhurried, with coffee going and the particular weekend quality of a house that wasn't being used efficiently. And she said, "You seem like yourself lately." He'd looked up from his coffee. As opposed to? As opposed to someone who's also managing something else at the same time. He'd been quiet for a moment. Then, "I didn't realize it showed that much." "It showed," she said, not unkindly. "You're good at managing things. That's different from it not showing." He looked at her across the kitchen. The morning light was coming through the window at that particular October angle that makes even ordinary rooms look considered. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked. "About her? About—" "No," Emma said. "I don't." She picked up her coffee. "I just wanted you to know I noticed the difference." Ryan held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, and they let the subject settle where it had landed, which was exactly where it belonged. Not avoided, not dwelled on, just acknowledged and set aside, which was the right relationship to have with something that was finished. What wasn't finished, and what was becoming more interesting to Emma as the months progressed, was the question of what they were actually building between them. Not the company, that was clear, that had a plan and a timeline and measurable milestones. What they were building in the house, in the evenings, in the space between who they had been in December and who they were becoming now. It wasn't a sudden thing. It never was, she thought, when it was real. The sudden things, the romantic gestures, the declared moments, those were easier to perform than to mean. What she and Ryan had was slower and less dramatic, and she had come to understand more durable precisely because of that. It was built on the same principles as the company work. You identify the problem honestly, you do the unglamorous maintenance. You show up on the days when showing up is the only thing you have to offer, and you trust that the accumulation of days is what builds something that holds. There was an evening in late October when Ryan came home from the Delaware County site with mud on his boots and a kind of tiredness that was the good kind. The tiredness of someone who had done real work, not the tired while exhausted feeling she'd seen in him during the winter. He washed his hands at the sink and then stood at the counter and looked at Emma, who was at the kitchen table with her laptop, and said nothing for a moment. "What?" she asked. "Nothing." He poured himself a glass of water. "Just looking." She held his gaze. Something about the way he'd said it, simply without any management of it, made her set down her laptop. "Come sit," she said. He came and sat across from her, and they talked about nothing in particular for a while. The site, a funny exchange he'd had with one of the field supervisors, something Marcus had said about a concrete pour that had gone slightly sideways and been recovered through what Marcus called creative problem solving, and what Ryan described as controlled panic. Emma laughed, which she was doing more easily these days, the specific laugh of someone who had stopped monitoring herself too closely in the company of one particular person. Ryan watched her laugh with an expression she'd started recognizing as the one he wore when he'd stopped managing his own face and was just in the moment. It was a good expression. It made him look younger and easier and more like the person she'd caught glimpses of in the early months, the person underneath the version that had been carrying too much for too long. "I want to ask you something," he said when the conversation had settled. Emma waited. "Last December." He looked at the table, then at her. "The morning after the wedding, when you woke up and I was gone." She held his gaze. "I remember." "I've thought about that morning a lot," he said. "What you must have—" He stopped. "I knew it was wrong, in the moment, going in early. But I didn't know how to stay and also not—" He paused, and she could see him working to find the accurate language. "Not pretend to feel things I wasn't sure I felt yet." Emma was quiet for a moment. She thought about the note on the kitchen counter, the coffee maker set to brew at 6:30, the way she'd read the note twice and folded it and stood in the kitchen in her pajamas and not cried. "I understood it," she said. "Not in the moment, but after." "That's not the same as it being okay." "No." She held his gaze. "It's not." He looked at her directly. "I'm sorry for that morning, for the months where He paused. "Where I made you navigate something that was my problem without telling you the shape of it." Emma looked at him. She thought about December, about January and the whiteboard and the parking lot and the lobby conversations and the June night and the attorney's office and all the accumulated distance between those moments and this kitchen in October. "You told me when you were ready," she said. "That's what matters." "You deserve to know sooner." "Maybe." She tilted her head slightly. "But you had to get there yourself. I couldn't have made you ready. And if I'd tried, you would have resented it and we wouldn't be sitting here." She paused. "I'd rather be sitting here." Ryan looked at her for a long time. The kitchen was quiet the way it got in the evenings now. A productive quiet. The quiet of a house that had been lived in and not just occupied. "I would too," he said. Simply. "More than I know how to say, Emma." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The same gesture, the same table, reversed now from the direction it had first happened. He turned his hand and held hers, and they sat in the kitchen in October and let it be what it was, which was enough. More than enough. Richard's health scare came in November, a cardiac event, minor in the clinical sense, but alarming in every other, that put him in the hospital for 3 days and sent a particular kind of current through the company and through the family. Ryan drove to the hospital the morning it happened and called Emma from the parking lot, not dramatically, but with the controlled quality of someone managing their own fear through logistics. "He's stable," Ryan said. "They're saying it's manageable." "I'm coming," Emma said. "You don't have—" "I'm coming." She drove to the hospital and found Ryan in the waiting room outside the cardiac unit, and she sat beside him and didn't fill the silence with reassurances that weren't hers to give. She just sat there, which was what the moment required, and he looked at her when she sat down with an expression of simple relief that had nothing performative in it at all. Richard spent 3 days in the hospital. Emma was there each day, not for long stretches. She managed the office from her phone and her laptop, which Gerald handled with the competence of someone who'd been waiting for years to show he could, and she returned calls and approved documents and kept the Delaware County project on its track. But she came to the hospital each day, and she sat with Richard when Ryan needed to step out. And Richard was not a man who engaged in sentiment during medical crises, but he was also, it turned out, not a man who failed to notice who showed up. On the second day, when Ryan had gone to get coffee and Emma was sitting beside Richard's bed, he looked at her with the same directness he always looked at everything and said, "You're running the company." "Gerald and Patrick are covering the operations," she said. You're running it." He was not interested in the deflection. "The Delaware County meeting went well this morning?" "Yes, Patrick handled it. He did fine." Richard was quiet for a moment. He looked older in the hospital, not diminished, but the particular truth of age that ordinary life and a well-pressed shirt and the forward momentum of a busy man could usually keep in the background was in the foreground here. "I've been thinking about the transition," he said. "More seriously since—" He gestured vaguely at the room around him, at the monitors and the IV line. "Richard, you don't need to—" "I want to." He looked at her steadily. "I want it to go to both of you, not to Ryan, to both of you. That needs to be formal." Emma held his gaze. "We can talk about that when you're home." "I want to say it now." A pause. "Because I didn't say it clearly enough before. I brought you into this family for Ryan. I thought you'd be good for him. I didn't anticipate—" He paused, and for Richard, who was not a man who reached for words he couldn't find, the pause was something that you'd be good for all of it, for the whole thing. He looked at the window for a moment. "My wife used to say I built good things, but I wasn't always good at seeing what I had." He looked back at Emma. She was right. Emma sat with this. She thought about what it cost a man like Richard to say something like that in a hospital room with a cardiac monitor running. "You built something real," she said. "That's not nothing. That's actually everything." Richard looked at her. Then he closed his eyes, not from tiredness, but from something else, something that was its own kind of rest. "Go check on Ryan," he said. "He's been standing in the hallway for 20 minutes pretending to look at his phone." Emma found Ryan exactly where Richard had said he'd be. He was leaning against the wall with his phone in his hand, not reading it, looking at the middle distance with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when something was working through him that hadn't finished yet. She stopped beside him and leaned against the wall too. "He wants to formalize the transition," she said, "to both of us." Ryan looked at her. "He told you that?" "Just now." Ryan looked back at the middle distance. "He's been thinking about it for a while. The cardiac thing just—" He stopped. "Just moved the timeline." "How do you feel about that?" Emma asked. He thought about it the way he thought about everything that mattered, actually, with the full machinery of his attention, rather than the quick surface processing that most people offered for questions that were really about something underneath. "I feel like it's right," he said. "Not because it should be equal, because it actually is." He turned to look at her. "You didn't take anything from me, Emma. You just—" He shook his head slightly. "You made it bigger. The whole thing. The company and—" He stopped again. "And everything else." Emma looked at him in the hospital hallway with the institutional light and the sounds of a working medical floor around them, which was not the context in which she'd imagined certain kinds of things being said, but the right things didn't wait for the right context, she'd learned. They came when they came. I want to make it official, Ryan said. Not just the company role. Us. He looked at her with the full, direct attention. I want us to be real, not an arrangement, not a working partnership that also lives together. I want, he seemed to find it, the accurate thing, I want to choose you, on purpose, because I want to, not because the circumstances didn't give me another option. Emma looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman she'd been in December, sitting across from this man in a restaurant and making terms. She thought about everything that had happened since, and everything it had cost and what it had built. You already chose me, she said. You've been choosing me for months. You chose me in the parking lot in June. You chose me at the attorney's office. You chose me every time you came home and sat at that table and actually talked to me instead of just sharing a house. I know. He held her gaze. I want to say it out loud anyway. She looked at him. Then say it. I choose you, he said, directly, without theater. Emma, I choose you. She felt something move in her chest, not the sharp, sudden thing that people wrote about, but something steadier and deeper, the feeling of a load-bearing thing settling into its final position after a long time of finding it. I choose you, too, she said. He reached out and touched her face, briefly, with the back of his hand, and she leaned into it for just a moment, and that was how it happened. In a hospital hallway in November, unglamorous and true, without music or lighting or any of the staging that people use to mark the moments they want to remember. She would remember it anyway. Richard came home on the 4th day. He walked into the Bennett house. They'd moved him to Ryan and Emma's house for the first 2 weeks of recovery, which Richard had resisted and ultimately accepted with the pragmatism of a man who understood when a decision had been made, and sat in the kitchen and drank the tea Emma made him, which he accepted without complaint, and looked around the kitchen with the expression of a man taking inventory of something he valued. You rearranged the cabinet, he said. Emma looked up. The spices. 2 months ago. You could see them better. He looked at the cabinet. Which was his version of approval. Richard's recovery was not smooth or fast, because it wasn't the kind of man he was to do things smoothly or fast when difficult would do. He pushed at the edges of what the cardiologist had told him to do, not recklessly but persistently, in the way of someone who had operated at a certain speed for 50 years and found rest structurally uncomfortable. Emma managed this partly by giving him things to do that were not physically demanding and felt like they mattered, which they did. She brought him documents to review, asked for his read on a Delaware County timeline question, consulted him on a subcontractor dispute that Gerald had escalated. Ryan watched this with the expression of someone who was learning something. You're giving him work, Ryan said one evening. I'm consulting him on things that benefit from his experience, Emma said, which is also work. He's supposed to be resting. He's supposed to have low physical exertion and reduce stress. Reading a subcontractor dispute document is not physically stressful. She looked at Ryan steadily. He needs to feel useful. That's not vanity. That's who he is. Ryan was quiet for a moment, then, My mother used to do that, he said. Give him things to do when he was sick. He'd complain about resting and she'd hand him something to read and he'd be quiet for an hour. It was the first time Ryan had mentioned his mother directly. Emma looked at him with the particular attention she gave to things she hadn't been given before, the attentiveness of someone who understood that certain doors opened once and shouldn't be walked past. What was she like? Emma asked. Ryan sat down at the kitchen table. He turned his coffee cup once, then again. Practical, he said. Funny in a dry way. She didn't take things harder than they needed to be taken. He paused. She and my father built the company together in the early years. She did the books, managed the office. When they had enough to bring people in, she stepped back. She said she preferred it, but... He paused. I think she would have liked having a reason to stay in it. Emma looked at him. She would have liked this, she said. What we're doing. Ryan looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said it quietly. I think she would have. December came, and with it the first anniversary of their wedding, which neither of them had mentioned in advance, and both of them had clearly been aware of without discussing it, which was a particular kind of thing, the thing where two people who have come to know each other well enough know what the other person is tracking without needing to name it. Ryan came home that evening with two things: dinner from a restaurant Emma had mentioned once in passing months ago that she'd been meaning to try, he'd remembered, which she hadn't expected or had expected in the abstract but been moved by in the specific, and a small box. She saw the box and felt something that was not quite readiness and not quite surprise, more the feeling of something arriving that had been on its way. "It's not a replacement," he said before she opened it. "The ring we used at the ceremony. I want you to keep that. I'm not trying to... That's not what this is." She opened the box. Inside was a simple band, gold, narrow, plain. No stone, no ornamentation. The kind of ring that looked exactly like what it was, which was a thing that had been chosen with care precisely because it didn't need to perform anything. "I wanted something that was just us," Ryan said. "Not the arrangement, not what we started with, just what we are now." Emma looked at the ring in the box. She thought about December a year ago. The cold bed, the note on the counter, standing in the kitchen in her pajamas with a cup of coffee, and the weight of what she'd walked into. She thought about the whiteboard diagrams and the parking lot encounters, and the kitchen table conversations in the hospital hallway, and the October evening when he'd said, "I choose you," and she'd felt something settle that had been finding its position for a year. She thought about her father at the kitchen table with the bank notices, and about 23 employees, and about the specific calculation she'd made in December that had been about survival and had become, through the particular alchemy of sustained effort and time and two imperfect people choosing to stay, about something else entirely. "Put it on," she said. He took it from the box and put it on her finger, right hand, alongside the ring from the ceremony on her left, not replacing it, just present alongside it, which was what he'd said and what she'd understood. She looked at both rings for a moment. "Happy anniversary," Ryan said, and smiled, the easy smile, the one she'd first seen at the wedding dinner when he laughed at his cousin's joke, the one she'd been watching become more frequent for a year. "Happy anniversary," she said. They ate the dinner he'd brought at the kitchen table, which was right, because the kitchen table was where most of the real things had happened, and they talked and laughed in the easy way they'd built over 12 months of evenings. And later Emma stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the December night. The same cold and dark as a year ago, the same Ohio winter, and felt the distance between that December and this one as a physical thing, the way you feel the distance you've walked when you stop and look back at where you started. The following spring, the Delaware County project broke ground. Emma stood on the site the morning of the groundbreaking in her work boots. She'd bought a pair in November, at Gerald's suggestion, which had come in the form of him leaving a catalog on her desk, open to the right page, which was about as much as you could ask from Gerald, and watched the first excavator begin its work, and felt the particular satisfaction of something real starting to be built. Ryan stood beside her. Richard was there too, looking better than he had in November, still moving more carefully, still wearing the slight caution of a man who had been reminded of something, but present and upright, and looking at the site with the expression of someone who had spent his life watching first dirt move and had not lost the feeling of it. 46 years, Richard said. To nobody in particular, or to both of them, or to the site. Marcus was on the site, going over the grading plan with his crew. He looked up and gave Emma a single nod across the distance, which she returned, and went back to his work. Carol had come in early that morning and left a card on Emma's desk, which Emma had found when she came back from the groundbreaking. It said, in Carol's handwriting, 14 years I've been here. The company is the best it's been in at least 8. And under that, in smaller writing, you know what you did. Just wanted to say so. Emma put the card in the folder in her desk drawer, alongside the email from Hector Rodriguez that she'd printed in January of the previous year. Thank you for paying on time. It makes a difference. And the first successful subcontractor invoice that had cleared on day 12, and a few other things she'd kept without meaning to. The small paper record of a year that had been about building something one unglamorous piece at a time. Her parents came to the groundbreaking. Her father shook Ryan's hand in the parking lot of the site, and then, which was unusual for him, he was not a demonstrative man, put his other hand over Ryan's and held it for a moment. The same gesture he'd made at the wedding reception, but with a different quality now, a year's worth of information in it. Her mother stood beside Emma while they watched the excavator work and said, "Your father slept well last night." Emma looked at her. "Yeah? The first time in a long time that he slept without—" Her mother paused. "Without the weight." She looked at the site. He called it a debt, but it was more than that. It was the feeling that he'd failed somehow, that he'd put you in a position where— "He didn't fail," Emma said. "I know." Her mother looked at her. "But he felt it. You know how he is." "I know how he is." Emma looked at the site, at the machine working, at the ground being moved in preparation for something. "He can let it go now." "He is," her mother said. "That's what I'm telling you." Emma stood in the April morning on the job site of the Delaware County project, with her mother beside her and Ryan a few feet away talking to Richard and the site crew moving around them, and she thought about what it actually was, this thing she'd built over a year and a half. It wasn't a triumph. It wasn't a defeat of anyone or a vindication of any particular position she'd held. It was something more ordinary and more durable than either of those things. It was a life. Built in the places where lives actually get built. At kitchen tables, in morning commutes, in break room conversations and whiteboard diagrams and difficult meetings, and the kind of evenings where nothing particular happens but something accumulates. And the decision to stay when leaving would have been easier. And the decision to work when working was harder than watching. And the decision to tell the truth when the truth was complicated and someone needed to hear it anyway. She thought about something she'd understood over the course of the year that she hadn't understood going in. That the things that look like sacrifices at the beginning, the choice made under pressure, the arrangement entered out of necessity, the morning you wake up in a cold bed with a note on the counter, are not always diminishments. Sometimes they're the doorway to something you would never have found if you'd had the luxury of a simpler beginning. The complicated beginning means you can't rely on romance or coincidence or the easy feeling that this was meant to happen. You have to build it. You have to choose it, specifically on days when choosing it costs something. That's what makes it real when it is real. Ryan came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, looking at the site, close enough that their arms were touching, and she felt the warmth of him and the ease that had replaced the careful distance of December and thought, this is what it looks like when something works. Not perfect, not without scars, just working. "You're thinking something," Ryan said. "A few things." "Anything you want to share?" She looked at the excavator turning in the spring morning, at the fresh dirt and the staked ground and the beginnings of a structure that would take a year to complete and serve people for decades. She looked at her father talking to Carol across the parking lot, her mother watching the site with a quiet contentment she'd earned. She looked at Richard standing with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the project with the expression of a man who had built things his whole life and still found the beginning of a build worth watching. She looked at Ryan beside her. "I was thinking about something my mother used to say when I was a kid," she said. She'd say, when I was worried about something not working out, she'd say, "Just stay in it. Stay in it and do the work and see what the thing becomes." Ryan was quiet for a moment. "Smart woman." "She is." Emma looked at the site. "I've been thinking about that a lot this year, about staying in things, about what you find when you don't leave." "What do you find?" he asked. She thought about the honest answer. "Sometimes nothing," she said. "Sometimes the thing is just as bad as it looked at the beginning and staying in it was the wrong call." She paused. "But sometimes, if the bones of it are right, if the thing underneath is actually worth building, you find out that the beginning was just the beginning, that the real thing was further in." Ryan looked at her. The April light was doing what April light does in Ohio. Generous and tentative at the same time, the way the season itself was, not quite committed to warmth yet, but moving toward it with clear intention. "The bones were right," he said. "Yes," she said. "They were." He reached over and took her hand, right there on the job site in front of the crew and her parents and Richard and Marcus and everyone else, not as a performance, but as the simple act of a man who had decided what he wanted and was no longer inclined to be careful about showing it. She held his hand and watched the first ground break on something real. There's something that nobody tells you about building a life from a broken beginning. It doesn't feel heroic while you're doing it. It feels like showing up on a Tuesday when Tuesday has nothing to recommend it. It feels like fixing a payment process that nobody else thought was worth fixing. It feels like standing in a parking lot with a cup of coffee going cold, deciding not to let someone see that they've gotten to you. It feels like the kitchen table at 9 o'clock on an ordinary evening, talking about something that matters to somebody you've decided to take seriously. The heroism, if you can call it that, is invisible from the outside. It doesn't look like anything. It looks like a woman going to work. It looks like a man choosing to be honest when the honest thing was harder. It looks like two imperfect people in a kitchen in Ohio making a decision every day that they could have unmade and choosing for their own private reasons that don't need to be performed for anyone not to. Emma Carter had walked into a marriage that was a contract and had built it into something that was hers. Not because someone gave it to her, not because things worked out, because she stayed in it and she did the work and she found out what the thing became. What it became was this: a company that ran better than it had in years, with people in it who felt the difference and showed up accordingly. A family that had been held together by one person's fear and was now held together by something more durable, which was the ordinary daily choice of people who had looked at what they had and decided it was worth the maintenance. A marriage that had started as a transaction and become through the particular alchemy of time and effort, and two people being honest with each other in the small ways that matter more than the large ones. An actual love, not a perfect love, not the kind you perform, the kind you build, the kind that when you look back at the beginning of it, the cold bed, the note on the counter, the coffee maker set to brew at 6:30, you understand that even the hardest part of it was necessary, because you needed that morning. You needed the difficulty of the thing to know what you were made of and what it was made of, and whether either of those things was worth staying for. Emma had stayed, and that, in the end, was the whole story.